Jesse Cobb had never seen Nathan Calloway bleed before. Not when a bull threw him against a fence rail, not when he broke 2 fingers wrestling a calf out of a mud hole. Nathan didn't bleed in front of people. He fixed things quietly alone. Now his knuckles were split open against a barn door he'd just put his fist through, screaming for a foreman who no longer existed. 4,000 acres, 600 head of cattle, not one man left who could count past 10. Nathan had told the whole territory he needed no one. Now he stood in the wreckage of that lie, 3 days from losing everything his father ever built. Before we go any further, if stories of broken men and unbreakable women speak to your heart, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Not when a bull threw him against a fence rail 3 summers back. Not when he broke 2 fingers wrestling a calf out of a mud hole. Nathan Calloway didn't bleed in front of people. He fixed things quietly alone the way his father taught him, and nobody ever saw the cost of it. Now his knuckles were open to the bone, and he was screaming at a barn door like it owed him money. "Boss." Jesse stepped forward with his hands raised the way a man approaches a spooked horse. "Boss, that door didn't do nothing to you." "Get away from me, Jesse." "Cooper, go fetch the bandages." "I don't need bandages." Nathan turned, and his eyes were wild in a way none of them had seen. Behind him, a ledger book lay open in the dirt, its pages torn loose and scattered across the barn floor like dead leaves. Numbers, debts, names of men who no longer worked for him crossed out in his own furious hand. "I need a foreman who can walk. I need a cook who didn't quit on a Tuesday for no reason at all. I need 2 hired hands who didn't take my wages and ride off toward Cheyenne like a pair of common thieves." Nobody answered him. There was nothing to say. Every word he'd said was true. 4,000 acres of grassland, more cattle than most men in the territory would see in a lifetime. And in the space of 9 days, it had all come apart at the seams, like a coat left too long in the rain. Hollis, his foreman for 11 years, had gone down off a horse and broken his leg in 2 places. Mildred, who'd cooked for the bunkhouse since before Jesse was hired, packed her things without a word of explanation and left on the morning stage. Dale and Frank, the 2 seasonal men he'd paid in advance for spring branding, simply never came back from town. And Nathan Calloway, who had built his name on never needing another living soul, stood in his own barn with blood running down his wrist, staring at the wreckage of everything he swore he had under control. "Somebody get the whiskey," Cooper muttered. "I don't want whiskey." Nathan pressed his palm against the doorframe, breathing hard. "I want this ranch to run the way it's supposed to run." Jesse crouched down and started gathering the loose pages of the ledger, smoothing them flat against his knee. "Boss, you've been awake 3 nights straight. You can't keep doing everything yourself." "Watch me." "You fell asleep on your horse yesterday. Ranger brought you back to the yard on his own. You didn't even wake till he stopped at the trough." Nathan didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer to give. He looked down at his hand, at the blood drying dark between his fingers, and for one long moment, something in his face cracked open. Something none of the men standing in that barn had permission to see. Then it closed again, the way it always did, and he was just Nathan Calloway once more. Ranch owner, 36 years old. A man who had never once in his life admitted he was drowning. "Fine," he said. "Fine. Somebody ride into town. Put an advertisement in the paper. I need a hand. Anybody who can work cattle, keep books, cook a meal that won't kill a man, I don't care." "You sure about that, boss?" Cooper asked. "Last man who answered one of your ads lasted 4 days. I'm not asking your opinion, Cooper. I'm giving an order." Jesse rode into Larkspur that same afternoon and placed the notice himself, standing at the counter of the newspaper office while the clerk counted out his coins. He didn't think much of it. Men came and went from the Calloway ranch. Nathan drove them hard and expected more than most outfits paid for, and half the territory already knew better than to answer his ads twice. Nobody expected the woman who came instead. The stagecoach rolled into Larkspur 4 days later, dust rising behind its wheels in a long gray tail, and half the town happened to be standing along the main street when the door swung open. She stepped down slow, careful, with her skirts, a single worn traveling case in one hand, and a folded newspaper clipping in the other. Her hair was chestnut brown, braided simple and neat despite 3 days of hard travel. Her eyes were a warm hazel steady, the kind of eyes that didn't flinch from a stare, and she was a big woman. Broad through the shoulders, full through the middle, built solid the way a person gets built from real work rather than idle years. There was no apologizing in the way she carried herself, no hunching to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. The street noticed anyway. "Lord have mercy," someone muttered from the boardwalk. A cluster of men near the feed store didn't bother lowering their voices. "That can't be for the Calloway job. She'll eat more than she earns, I'd wager." The woman didn't turn to see who'd said it. She simply smoothed the front of her traveling dress, tucked the newspaper clipping into her sleeve, and asked the stagecoach driver, calm as still water, "Which way is the Calloway Ranch, sir?" "3 miles north, ma'am. Big spread, can't miss it." The driver hesitated, glancing at her case. "You got someone meeting you?" "I expect I'll walk if I have to." She didn't have to. Jesse had come into town for supplies and recognized the situation the moment he saw a stranger standing alone with a travel case and no one stepping forward to help her. He tipped his hat and offered the wagon bed, and if he thought anything of the woman's size, he kept it off his face. Jesse Cobb had grown up the youngest of 9 children and learned early that a person's worth wasn't carried in their waistline. "Name's Jesse Cobb," he said, helping her case up onto the wagon. "You answering the ranch advertisement?" "I am. Abigail Harper." She climbed up beside him without waiting for a hand settling her skirts with practiced efficiency. "Is it true the foreman broke his leg and the cook left without notice?" Jesse blinked. "How'd you hear that already?" "Notice only went in the paper 4 days back." "I didn't hear it. I read the advertisement carefully. A man doesn't ask for a ranch hand, a cook, and someone who can keep books all in the same notice, unless his whole operation just came apart at once." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'd guess it happened within the same week. Possibly the same few days." Jesse stared at her a moment too long before he remembered to snap the reins. "You a fortune teller, Miss Harper?" "No, Mr. Cobb. I've simply seen ranches fall apart before. They rarely fall apart slow." Nathan was standing at the corral when the wagon rolled into the yard, and he didn't bother hiding his disappointment. He'd pictured someone lean and capable, maybe a widow with grown sons, maybe a drifter who knew cattle and wasn't afraid of long hours. He hadn't pictured a woman built like Abigail Harper climbing down off Jesse's wagon and walking toward him like she already owned the ground beneath her boots. "Mr. Calloway." She extended her hand, and when he didn't take it right away, she didn't lower it either. "Abigail Harper. I'm here about the position." "Ma'am, I don't think—" "You don't think I can do the work." She said it plainly without heat, the way another person might comment on the weather. "You're looking at me and deciding I'll slow your outfit down instead of speed it up." "I understand. I've had that conversation before." Behind Nathan, a ranch hand snorted into his sleeve. Nathan didn't turn around, but the corner of his jaw tightened. "It's not personal," he said. "This is hard work, long days. I need someone who can keep pace with cattle, not a woman my size." Abigail finished the sentence for him, calm as ever. "Mr. Calloway, I didn't come here because I'm strong enough to wrestle a steer to the ground. I came because your ranch is bleeding money and time in ways your men are too close to see, and I know how to stop the bleeding. That's a different kind of strength. It's the kind you're currently short on." Nathan's eyebrows drew together. "That's a bold thing to say to a man you met 30 seconds ago. It's a true thing to say to a man whose foreman is laid up, whose cook quit without warning, and whose ledger I'd bet hasn't balanced clean in over a year." She held his gaze without blinking. "Am I wrong?" Nathan didn't answer. That was answer enough. "Boss." Cooper called from the fence, grinning. "You want I should tell her the bunkhouse is that way, or you want to do the honors?" A few of the other hands laughed outright. Abigail's expression didn't change, but Nathan caught something flicker behind her eyes. Not embarrassment, not quite. Something older and more tired than that. The look of a person who had heard the same joke in a dozen different towns and had long ago stopped expecting it to stop. "I'll pay my own way back to town if I'm wrong within 1 week," she said to Nathan. "You won't owe me a dime of wages if I don't earn them. All I'm asking is the chance to prove it before you decide." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, the barn door still hung slightly crooked from where his fist had struck it that morning. His hand throbbed under its makeshift bandage. Somewhere past the corral, Hollis lay in the bunkhouse with his leg splinted and useless, and the kitchen sat cold and empty because no one else knew how to run it. He was 3 days from losing cattle to spoiled feed, and men to unpaid wages, and pride had gotten him exactly nowhere in the last 9 days, except bleeding in a barn. "1 week," he said finally. "You don't slow my men down, you don't cause trouble, and you earn your keep every single day. First sign you can't do the work, you're back on the next stage. Understood?" "Understood, Mr. Calloway. Jesse'll show you where you're sleeping. Cook's quarters, since that's empty now." "Actually," Abigail said, "before I settle in, I'd like to see your supply room and your books. If your operation's in the state I suspect it's in, there's no sense wasting daylight." Nathan almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to disbelief. "You want to see my ledgers before you've even unpacked? Mr. Calloway, a ranch this size doesn't fall apart from bad luck. It falls apart from small mistakes nobody caught in time. The sooner I find them, the sooner I can fix them." She glanced toward the barn, toward the torn pages Jesse had gathered and set on a workbench. "I'd guess you've already lost more than you realize. I'd like to know how much before it gets worse." "Son." The supply room told her everything within the first 10 minutes. Grain sacks stacked wrong. The oldest buried under the newest, meaning the bottom bags would rot before anyone got to them. Tools scattered across 3 different sheds instead of kept together, which meant every job started with 15 minutes of searching. A crate of nails sat rusting because it had been left open to the weather, and a barrel of salt pork showed the telltale swelling of spoilage nobody had caught yet. "Who orders your supplies?" Abigail asked, crouching to examine a torn feed sack. "I do," Nathan said from the doorway, arms crossed. "Same supplier my father used. Garrett's Mercantile out of Larkspur." "How much do you pay per hundredweight of feed corn?" Nathan told her. Abigail didn't say anything right away. She simply looked at him, and something in her expression made his stomach drop before she even spoke. "Mr. Calloway, the going rate in this territory is at least 20% below that. I saw the price posted at 3 different suppliers on my way through Cheyenne last month before I ever knew I'd end up here. Either your Mr. Garrett is charging you a loyalty tax for staying with your father's old arrangement, or he's simply taking advantage of a man too busy running 4,000 acres to check the numbers himself." Nathan's jaw worked. "My father trusted Garrett for 20 years. Your father may have gotten a fair price 20 years ago. Prices change. Loyalty doesn't always follow them." She straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "I'm not telling you to distrust every man in town, Mr. Calloway. I'm telling you that nobody's checked this in a very long time, and it's costing you money every single week whether you notice it or not. And you noticed it in 10 minutes. I noticed it because I wasn't looking at your ranch with pride in the way. Pride makes a man see what he wants to see. I don't have any pride invested in this place yet. I just see what's here." Nathan didn't have a response for that. He watched her move through the rest of the supply room, watched her count sacks and check dates, and mutter numbers under her breath, like a woman doing arithmetic in a church pew, and something uncomfortable settled behind his ribs. He had built his whole reputation on being the man who needed nothing from anyone. In under an hour, a stranger had found 5 separate problems he hadn't seen in 5 years. "The ledgers," Abigail said, straightening. "I'd like to see those now if you don't mind." He minded. He minded quite a bit. But he led her to the house anyway. The ranch house kitchen table was covered in receipts, invoices, and a leather-bound ledger with a broken spine from years of hard use. Nathan hadn't touched it in 3 weeks, not since Hollis had still been walking and handling half the bookwork himself. Abigail sat down without being invited to and began turning pages. For a long while, she said nothing. Nathan stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching her read, and told himself he didn't care what she found. It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and he stood there anyway, because some part of him needed to know just how bad it was. "Mr. Calloway," she said eventually, "did you know you paid 3 different hands for the same week of branding work last spring? That's not possible. I sign every payment myself." "You sign what's put in front of you. That's not the same as checking it." She turned the ledger around so he could see the entries, her finger tracing 3 separate lines with 3 separate dates, but the same job description and nearly identical amounts. Someone padded these. Whether it was carelessness or theft, I can't say yet, but this alone cost you close to $40. Nathan crossed the room in 3 strides and leaned over the table, scanning the entries himself. His stomach turned cold. She was right. He'd signed all 3 without a second look, trusting Hollis's handwriting, the way he trusted everything about his own operation completely, and without question. "Who wrote these entries?" he asked, quieter now. "I don't know yet. That's your foreman's hand on 2 of them, and someone else's on the 3rd. I'd want to ask him directly before I accused anyone of anything." She looked up at him. "Mr. Calloway, I don't say this to shame you. Most ranch owners never look closely enough to catch this kind of thing. That's exactly how it keeps happening. You've been so busy holding everything up with your own 2 hands that nobody's been watching the small leaks. A ranch doesn't sink from one hole. It sinks from 100 small ones nobody bothered to patch." Nathan sat down slowly across from her. The fight had gone out of him for the moment, replaced by something heavier. He'd told himself for years that he had everything under control. Sitting there staring at $40 of theft or carelessness he'd signed off on himself, he understood for the first time just how much he hadn't been looking at. "Who told you my foreman's name was Hollis?" he asked suddenly. "I never said it." "You didn't have to. I asked Mr. Cobb on the ride out. A person learns more from a 5-minute conversation with a hired hand than from an hour arguing with the man who signs their wages." Abigail folded her hands atop the ledger. "Your men respect you, Mr. Calloway. They're also frightened of disappointing you, which means they don't always tell you the truth in time to be useful. That's not a flaw in them. That's a pattern you've built without meaning to." Nathan bristled at that old habit rising fast. "I've never punished a man for bringing me bad news. Maybe not with your fists, but I'd wager you've punished them plenty with your silence. A man goes quiet and cold when he's disappointed, and every hand on this ranch has learned to read that silence as a warning. So they stop bringing you the small troubles before they become large ones. They wait until they can't hide it anymore." She tapped the ledger. "This is what waiting looks like, Mr. Calloway. $40 is only the part you can see." "How bad is it?" he asked. "The whole picture, not just the feed corn and the payroll." Abigail didn't answer right away. She turned back several months in the ledger, running her finger down column after column, and Nathan watched her lips move slightly as she worked the numbers in her head. "Bad enough that if nothing changes, you'll be selling cattle at a loss by autumn just to cover your debts," she said finally. "Not because your land is poor or your herd is weak. Because nobody's minding the small things, and small things compound. I've seen it before. It's not usually the big disasters that ruin a ranch, Mr. Calloway. It's neglect one unchecked receipt at a time." Nathan sat back in his chair. Outside, he could hear Cooper laughing with one of the other hands, unaware of what was being uncovered at that kitchen table. For the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, Nathan Calloway felt something close to fear, not of losing a fight or a bull or a bad season, but of losing everything his father had built slowly, quietly, while he was too proud to ask for help. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Abigail closed the ledger gently and folded her hands on top of it. "Trust for 1 week. Not blind. Trust you can check every single thing I do, and I'd expect you to. But stop fighting me on small decisions before you've seen whether they work. Give me the kitchen, give me the supply room, and let me talk to your foreman about that payroll entry. By the end of the week, you'll have enough evidence to decide whether I'm worth keeping around." Nathan studied her for a long moment. There was no softness in the way she asked for it, no pleading, no attempt to make herself smaller or more agreeable than she was. She sat across from him solid and certain, a woman the whole town had already decided to laugh at. And he found himself against every instinct he'd built his life around, nodding. 1 week, he said again. Same terms as before. 1 week, Abigail agreed. She started in the kitchen before sunrise the next morning, and by the time the hands came in for breakfast, half of them stopped in the doorway like they'd walked into the wrong house. The stove was lit and running clean instead of smoking the way it had under Mildred's care these last few tired months. Biscuits sat browned, and even on a tray, and a pot of beans simmered with salt pork that didn't smell of spoilage because Abigail had thrown out the swollen barrel the night before and replaced it from a fresh order she'd negotiated herself at a lower price from a different supplier in town. "This ain't Mildred's cooking," Cooper said, eyeing his plate with open suspicion. "No," Abigail agreed, setting down a pot of coffee. "It's mine. Eat it before it gets cold. Mr. Cooper or don't. Makes no difference to me." He ate it. So did everyone else. Nobody said much, but Jesse noticed the plates came back cleaner than they had in weeks, and he noticed Cooper going back for a second biscuit despite himself. By mid-morning, Abigail had moved to the supply shed, reorganizing sacks and crates with the help of 2 hands she'd asked for politely, but with an authority that made it clear she wasn't truly asking. She separated the oldest grain to be used first, moved the tools into a single shed with a system Jesse could actually follow, and set aside a full crate of nails to be cleaned and salvaged instead of thrown out and repurchased. "You're gonna run us ragged," one of the younger hands muttered, hauling a sack across the yard. "I'm going to save you from hauling this same sack 3 separate times because nobody labeled it right the first time," Abigail said. "Give it a week. You'll thank me." By afternoon, she'd found the sick calf nobody had noticed pulled off from the rest of the herd, on her own initiative isolated before whatever ailed it could spread through the healthy stock. Nathan rode out when Jesse fetched him, expecting to find her wrong, expecting some overreaction from a woman who didn't know cattle the way his men did. He found her kneeling in the dirt instead, hands steady on the animal's flank, murmuring something low and calm while the calf trembled. "Scours," she said without looking up. "Early yet. If you'd left it with the herd another 2 days, you'd have had 6 sick calves instead of 1. I need clean water, not creek water, and I need it separated from the others until it passes." "How do you know cattle sickness?" Nathan asked, genuinely startled now. "I grew up on a ranch smaller than this one, Mr. Calloway, in a family that couldn't afford to lose a single head of stock to something a careful eye could have caught early. I learned young because we had to." She finally looked up at him, hazel eyes steady despite the sweat on her brow and the dirt on her skirts. "I told you. I didn't come here to lift what your strongest hand can lift. I came because I notice what gets missed. There's a difference, and it's the difference that's currently saving this calf's life." Nathan didn't answer. He watched her work a moment longer, watched the calm competence in her hands, and something shifted in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Something uncomfortable and unfamiliar, the way pride feels when it's being slowly, quietly dismantled by proof instead of argument. Dawson was saddling up for the morning ride when Nathan found him the payroll ledger tucked under one arm, 3 separate entries marked in Abigail's neat hand. "Got a question for you," Nathan said, and something in his voice made Dawson's hands go still on the cinch strap. "Boss?" "Branding week last spring. You're listed here twice under 2 different names, same job, same dates." Nathan held the ledger open. "Want to explain that to me?" Dawson's eyes flicked toward the kitchen window where lamplight still glowed even at this early hour, and his jaw tightened. "That woman's been digging through things that ain't her business. It's my ranch, Dawson. Everything in that ledger is my business, and you signed your name to money you didn't earn." Nathan kept his voice level, though his bandaged hand had curled into a fist at his side without him quite meaning it to. "I trusted Hollis's bookkeeping. I trusted you. Near $40 gone because I never once thought to check." "Nate, come on now, everybody stretches a little. Don't call me Nate." The words came out sharper than Nathan intended, and Dawson flinched. My father hired you when you were 17 years old with nothing to your name. I kept you on through 2 bad winters when other outfits would have let you go. And you took advantage of the one season I didn't have the time to watch every entry myself." Dawson didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have helped him. "Pack your things," Nathan said. "You're paid through the week, not a day past. And you're lucky I'm not riding into town to tell the sheriff what $40 of another man's money is called." Dawson left before noon, saddlebags packed, not a word of apology on his way out the gate. Nathan stood at the corral fence and watched him go, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he didn't feel the old familiar shame of having been made a fool of. He felt something closer to relief, the particular relief of a rotten board finally pried loose before it could bring down the whole floor. Abigail found him there an hour later, the ledger still tucked under his arm. "You handled that quicker than I expected," she said. "You handled finding it quicker than I expected." Nathan turned to look at her. 4 days ago, I'd have sworn on my father's grave that every man on this ranch was honest. Now, I don't know what else I've been too proud to check. "Then we'll check it," Abigail said simply. "One ledger entry at a time, if that's what it takes. Pride's an expensive habit, Mr. Calloway. I find it's usually cheaper to just look." She rode into Larkspur the next morning with a list of numbers in her sleeve, and Jesse driving the wagon beside her, and word of the fire hadn't even reached town yet. This was still an ordinary errand, and ordinary errands in Larkspur meant stairs. Well, look who decided to stick around. A woman outside the dry goods store said not quite quiet enough. Thought the Calloway outfit would have sent her packing by now. Abigail didn't slow her stride. "Good morning to you too, ma'am." Garrett's Mercantile sat at the end of the street, a wide storefront with barrels of nails and stacked feed sacks out front. And the man himself came around the counter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes the moment Abigail stepped through the door. "Miss Harper, was it heard tell you were sorting through Nathan's business?" "I am. I'd like to talk about the price you've been charging for feed corn." She set a folded paper on the counter, prices from 2 other suppliers written out in her own neat hand. "This is what Cheyenne merchants are asking this season. You're charging Mr. Calloway near a quarter more per hundredweight." Garrett's smile thinned. "Nathan's father and I had an arrangement. Trust built over 20 years. Trust isn't usually measured in a quarter extra per hundredweight, Mr. Garrett. I'd call that something closer to a habit you never expected anyone to check." Abigail kept her voice even pleasant, even the way she might discuss the weather. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I'm telling you that starting this week, Mr. Calloway will be ordering from whichever supplier offers a fair price, and I intend to make sure he knows exactly what fair looks like from now on." A few customers near the door had stopped pretending to shop and were openly listening. Garrett's face reddened. "Now see here, this ranch has done business with my family. Then your family ought to have kept the price honest, and this conversation wouldn't be necessary." She folded the paper back into her sleeve. "I've no interest in ruining your business, Mr. Garrett. I've an interest in making sure the Calloway Ranch stops paying for a friendship that only runs one direction. You're welcome to match the fair price. If you can't, I understand, and we'll take our custom elsewhere." She turned to leave, and that was when the laughter started low ugly from 2 men lounging near the stove at the back of the store. "Big talk for a woman who probably can't tell corn from oats," one of them drawled. Abigail stopped at the door, but didn't turn around right away. When she finally did, there was nothing rattled in her expression, only the same tired patience she'd worn since stepping off the stagecoach 4 days earlier. "I've been doing this work since before either of you owned a razor, gentlemen. Mock the way I look all you please. It hasn't slowed my arithmetic yet." She tipped her head to Garrett. "Good day, Mr. Garrett. I expect an answer on that price by Friday." Jesse was grinning ear to ear by the time she climbed back onto the wagon. "Ma'am, I don't believe I've ever seen Garrett go that particular shade of red. He'll come around. Men like that usually do once the money starts talking louder than the pride." She settled her skirts and glanced back once at the Mercantile where Garrett stood in the doorway watching them go, his jaw tight. "The mockery doesn't bother you as much after the first 100 times, Mr. Cobb. You'd be surprised what a person can grow used to. Jesse didn't have an answer for that. He snapped the reins and said nothing more the whole ride home. But he watched her out of the corner of his eye more than once, turning something over in his mind that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Nathan heard about the exchange before supper from Cooper, who'd heard it from a drover who'd been in the store himself. He found Abigail in the kitchen afterward, sleeves rolled to the elbow, kneading dough for the next morning's bread like the whole encounter hadn't cost her a thing. "You went after Garrett without asking me first," he said, not quite an accusation. "I did. You hired me to fix what needed fixing, Mr. Calloway. I didn't think that came with a requirement to wait for permission on every single decision, or I'd have said so before I agreed to the terms." She didn't look up from the dough. "If you'd rather I ask first from now on, say so plainly, and I will." Nathan considered that for a moment, arms crossed, watching her hands work the dough with the same steady confidence she brought to everything else. "No," he said finally. "Keep doing what you're doing. Just—" He paused, searching for the words. "Just don't let them get to you. The way they talk. They already have gotten to me, Mr. Calloway, more times than I could count, over more years than I'd like to admit." Abigail finally looked up. Hazel eyes steady, something old and weary flickering behind them before she tucked it away again. "I've simply learned that letting it stop my hands from working never once fed a single person, changed a single mind, or fixed a single problem. So I keep working. It's the only answer I've ever found that does any good." Nathan didn't know what to say to that. He stood in the kitchen doorway a moment longer, watching her shape the dough into loaves with quiet, practiced care, and something in him, something that had been closed tight since before his sister died. Since before he'd learned that needing people only ever led to losing them, creaked open half an inch further than it had in years. By the third night, the whispers in the bunkhouse had changed shape. She caught Dawson skimming off the feed count. Cooper told Jesse over their evening coffee, voice low. "Wrote it down clean as day. Boss confronted him this morning, and Dawson didn't even try denying it, just packed up and left before noon. She found that on her own. Found it in an afternoon what none of us caught in a year." Cooper shook his head, something almost like respect creeping into his voice despite himself. "I said some ugly things about her when she stepped off that wagon. Man like me ought to know better than to judge a person's worth by the size of 'em." "Ain't too late to tell her that," Jesse said. "Ain't too proud to either." Cooper glanced toward the kitchen window, where lamplight still burned. Despite the late hour, Abigail bent over the ledger again, working numbers long after the rest of the ranch had gone quiet. "Woman works harder than any three of us combined, and never once complains about it. Never once acts like she's better than us for catching what we missed either. Just fixes it and moves on to the next thing." Nathan heard some of that conversation from the porch, where he sat with his bandaged hand resting on his knee, watching the same lamplight Cooper had noticed. He'd spent 3 days waiting for Abigail Harper to fail, waiting for the moment he could tell himself he'd been right to doubt her, and instead every single day had proven the opposite. He rose and walked to the kitchen door, knocking once before letting himself in. Abigail looked up from the ledger pencil still in hand. "Mr. Calloway, something wrong?" "No." He stood in the doorway a moment, unsure exactly why he'd come. "Just wanted to see how the numbers were looking. Better than they were 3 days ago. Still worse than they ought to be, but better." She set down her pencil and studied him with the same steady patience she seemed to bring to everything. "You look like a man with something on his mind, Mr. Calloway. Might as well say it plain. I don't much care for guessing games." Nathan almost smiled at that. Almost. "My father used to say a ranch runs on the owner's back. Whatever gets done because the owner drives it. Everything else is just help." "Your father was wrong," Abigail said simply. "No offense meant to the dead, but a ranch this size doesn't run on one man's back, no matter how strong that back is. It runs on 100 small decisions made right day after day by people who care enough to make them right. You've been trying to be 100 people at once, Mr. Calloway. That's not strength. That's just a slower kind of drowning." Nathan stood very still. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. Not his hands who worked for him and knew better, not the men in town who respected him too much or feared him too little to say something so plain to his face. He should have been angry. He found instead that he was listening, really listening in a way he hadn't let himself listen to anyone since his father died. "You said something the day you arrived," he said slowly. "About seeing ranches fall apart before. Not slow, you said. Sudden." Abigail's expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of something guarded crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "I did say that. Was that your family's ranch?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Nathan thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its brisk certainty, gone softer around the edges. "My father died when I was 19. My brothers scattered within the year, chasing better prospects elsewhere, and the ranch went to my mother and me. We held it 4 more years before the bank took it." She looked down at the ledger at her own neat handwriting filling its pages. "I know what it looks like when pride keeps a person from asking for help until it's too late to matter. I watched it happen to my own mother, and I couldn't stop it because I was too young and too powerless to do anything but watch. I promised myself if I ever got the chance to stop it happening to someone else, I would." Nathan didn't know what to say to that. He stood in the doorway with his bandaged hand and his broken pride, and found himself for the first time in longer than he could remember looking at another person's pain instead of only his own. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "About your father, your family's land. Don't be sorry, Mr. Calloway. Be careful. That's the only thing that helps." She picked her pencil back up, though her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than the numbers required. "You've got 3 more days before our arrangement's up. I intend to use every one of them, making sure this ranch doesn't end up the way mine did." The fire started on the 4th night, and it started fast. Jesse smelled the smoke first, shouting the whole bunkhouse awake before anyone else had even opened their eyes. A lantern left burning too close to loose hay in the equipment barn. Nobody's fault exactly, or maybe everyone's fault a little. The kind of small carelessness that had been creeping through the ranch for months before Abigail ever arrived to catch it. By the time Nathan reached the yard, flame was already licking up the east wall orange light, throwing long shadows across the panicked shapes of men running for water buckets that weren't where they were supposed to be. "The buckets!" Cooper shouted. "Where in the hell are the buckets they used to hang right here?" "They're by the well now." Abigail's voice cut through the chaos sharp and clear, already running toward the source of it herself. Nightdress and boots and nothing else. Hair loose from its braid for the first time since she'd arrived. "I moved them Tuesday. They're closer to the water this way. Follow me." For one terrible instant, Nathan thought the whole barn would go, thought of the tools inside the harness, leather, the season's remaining feed stores that would take weeks to replace, at a cost the ranch could no longer absorb without breaking. Then Abigail was there at the well, hauling up bucket after bucket, and shoving them into the hands of every man who came near her, directing them with a calm authority that cut straight through the panic. "Wet the ground first, not the flame. You'll just spread embers if you go straight at it. Jesse, get the horses out the far side. Don't open that near door. You'll feed it air. Cooper, form a line. Pass the buckets, hand to hand. Don't run them individually. You'll waste half of every trip." They obeyed her. Every one of them, without question, in the middle of the worst crisis the ranch had faced in years, obeyed a woman half of them had mocked 4 days earlier. Nathan fought alongside them, his bandaged hand screaming with every bucket he hauled, smoke burning his eyes and throat. And through it all, he watched Abigail Harper move through the chaos like she'd trained for exactly this moment, her whole life, steady, clear-headed, thinking 3 steps ahead of the fire, while the rest of them fought to keep up with where it already was. It took the better part of an hour, but they held it. The east wall was scorched black, and half the roof would need rebuilding, but the barn stood. The tools were saved, and not a single man or animal was lost. Nathan sat in the dirt afterward, soot-streaked and exhausted, watching Abigail help Jesse check the horses one final time for burns or smoke sickness. His hand throbbed, his lungs ached, and underneath all of it, Something in his chest had gone quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet in years. "You saved that barn," he said when she finally came to sit near him, equally exhausted, equally soot-covered. "We saved that barn," she corrected. "I just knew where the buckets were." "You moved the buckets on Tuesday. You already knew this could happen." "I didn't know a fire would happen tonight, Mr. Calloway. I knew a barn with dry hay stacked too close to a lantern hook was one careless night away from disaster, and I fixed what I could fix." She wiped a streak of soot from her cheek, leaving another in its place. "That's all I've been doing since I arrived. Fixing what I could see needed fixing before it turned into something like this." Nathan looked at her for a long moment in the gray light. Before dawn. This woman, the whole town had laughed at 4 days ago. This woman, his own men had doubted, who had just spent the worst hour of the season directing them through a fire with more calm authority than he'd managed to summon himself. "Your week's not up till Saturday," he said quietly. "But I think we both know how this ends." Abigail looked at him, something careful and guarded still in her eyes, as though she'd been told promises before and learned not to trust them too quickly. "Don't decide anything tonight, Mr. Calloway. You're tired, and gratitude makes a poor foundation for a decision. Wait till Saturday. Let me earn it properly the way we agreed." "That's the thing," Nathan said, looking out at the scorched but standing barn, at the men still moving through the gray morning light, checking every corner for stray embers at the ranch that 4 days ago had been falling apart in his hands, and now somehow wasn't. "I don't think you have to earn it anymore. I think you already did." Abigail didn't answer right away. She sat beside him in the settling ash and the coming dawn, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, something in her shoulders eased just slightly, like a weight she'd been carrying without anyone noticing had finally shifted, if only an inch. Neither of them said another word. They simply sat there together in the wreckage, and the relief watching the sun come up over a ranch that had nearly burned to the ground, and somehow, against every expectation, the whole town had carried into that stagecoach yard 4 days earlier, hadn't. Hollis heard the commotion from the bunkhouse window, his splinted leg propped stiff on a folded blanket, and by the time Jesse came to tell him what had happened, the old foreman was already struggling to sit upright, cursing his own uselessness under his breath. "Fire," he said when Jesse finished. "Lord Almighty." And she had the buckets moved already before it even started. "Moved 'em Tuesday, Hollis. Swear it on my mother's grave." Jesse shook his head, still half in disbelief himself. "You should have seen her out there. Weren't scared for 1 second. Just kept telling us where to stand and what to do, calm as you please, like she'd fought 100 fires before." Hollis was quiet a moment, working his jaw the way he did when he was chewing on something uncomfortable. "I owe that woman an apology," he said finally. "Told Dawson myself first day she arrived that she wouldn't last the week. Told him she'd be gone by Sunday, crying on the stage back to wherever she came from. Well," Jesse allowed himself a small, tired grin, "might want to hold off on any more predictions, Hollis. Woman's proven near every man on this ranch wrong so far, and she ain't even had her full week yet." By the time full morning came, the ranch stirred slow and sore men moving through their chores with the particular exhaustion that follows a crisis survived rather than avoided. Nathan walked the length of the scorched barn wall alone, running his good hand along the blackened wood, doing the arithmetic of what it would cost to rebuild against what it would have cost to lose the whole structure and everything inside it. He found Abigail near the well, an hour later, refilling the buckets she'd moved 4 days before, setting them back exactly where they belonged, as though the fire had never happened at all. "You could rest," he said. "Nobody would think less of you for it after last night." "I know." She didn't stop working. "Resting doesn't rebuild a barn wall, Mr. Calloway, and I found that the day after something goes wrong is usually the day people are most willing to change how they've been doing things. Best not to waste it." Nathan almost smiled at that, the first real almost smile he'd allowed himself in longer than he cared to count. "You've got an answer for everything." "Not everything, just the parts I've already lived through once before." She set the last bucket in its place and straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, meeting his eyes without flinching the way she had every single time since she'd first stepped down off that stagecoach, into a town that had already decided what she was worth, before she'd said a single word. The rest of it, Mr. Calloway, I suppose we'll have to work out as we go. He looked at her a long moment, at the soot still smudged along her jaw, at the steady certainty in her stance, despite a night that would have broken most people he knew and understood quietly, without needing to say it aloud just yet. That whatever arrangement had brought her here 4 days ago had already become something else entirely. Something the whole ranch, and maybe the whole town of Larkspur, was only just beginning to reckon with. Saturday came gray and quiet, smoke still hanging faint over the scorched barn wall, and every hand on the ranch found some reason to be within earshot of the porch that morning. Nathan stood at the top step with the ledger in his hands. The same ledger that had once been a mess of hidden theft and unchecked numbers, now organized in Abigail's careful script. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't need to. Word traveled fast on a ranch this size, and every man there already knew what this morning meant. "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice carried farther than he intended. "Your week's up." Abigail stood at the bottom of the steps. Apron still dusted with flour from the morning's baking, hands folded in front of her, the way she always held them when she expected bad news, and had trained herself not to flinch from it first. "I'm aware, Mr. Calloway. You saved that calf. You caught Dawson stealing. You negotiated a fair price out of a man who's been overcharging this ranch for 20 years, and 2 nights ago, you very likely saved this entire operation from burning to the ground." Nathan closed the ledger. "I don't believe in dragging out what doesn't need dragging out. You're hired. Full wages, same as I'd pay any foreman starting today." A ripple went through the men gathered near the corral. Not shock, not anymore, but something closer to satisfaction, like watching a fight end the way everyone already knew it would. Abigail didn't smile right away. She studied him a moment, the way she studied everything, weighing his words for the truth underneath them. "Same wages as Hollis was drawing." "Same wages as Hollis was drawing," Nathan confirmed. "You'll answer to me, nobody else. And if any man on this ranch has a problem taking direction from a woman, he's welcome to collect his pay and ride out same as Dawson did." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word against it. Cooper, who 4 days ago had made the joke about her eating more than she earned, was the first to step forward and offer his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I said an ugly thing when you stepped off that wagon. I'd like to take it back if you'll let me." Abigail shook his hand firm and unhurried. "Consider it taken back, Mr. Cooper. Now let's see if you work half as hard as you talk." The men laughed, real laughter this time, not the mean kind from before, and something in the yard shifted, settled the way a house settles once its foundation's been repaired. The work didn't slow down after that. If anything, it sped up. Abigail moved through the ranch like she'd been born to it, rising before the sun, and rarely sitting until well past dark. And within a week, the changes were plain enough that even the men who still felt strange taking orders from a woman couldn't argue with the results. She reorganized the cattle by health and age, separating the weaker stock so they could be fed and watched more closely, instead of getting trampled at the trough by stronger animals. She changed the feeding schedule to cut down on waste, and within days, the grain bill dropped by nearly a third. She caught 2 more hands padding their hours. Not stealing outright, just rounding up an extra 30 minutes here and there. The kind of small dishonesty that adds up over a season into real money. "Wilkins," she said one afternoon, standing at the fence with a stopwatch she'd brought from her own belongings. "You clocked 4 hours mending that stretch of fence. I watched you take a 2-hour dinner break in the middle of it." Wilkins flushed red to his collar. "Ma'am, a man's gotta eat. A man's gotta eat on his own time, or on the ranch's time, not both counted as the same hour." She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. "I'm not docking your pay this once because I believe you didn't think anyone was counting closely enough to notice. But I am counting, Mr. Wilkins. Every hour, every day from here forward. Understood?" "Understood, ma'am." Nathan watched these small confrontations happen one after another over the following days, and each time he expected resentment to build. Expected the men to start grumbling behind her back, the way ranch hands always grumbled about anyone who tightened the reins. Instead, something stranger happened. The men who worked hardest started working harder because for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, Hard work actually meant something. It got noticed. It got rewarded. The men who'd been coasting either fell in line or found their own reasons to leave, and either way, the ranch ran cleaner for it. "You're not just fixing the ranch," Nathan said to her one evening, watching her balance the week's accounts at the kitchen table. "You're fixing how it runs." That's a different thing entirely. It's the same thing, Mr. Calloway. A ranch is only as honest as the people running it, and people are only as honest as the system lets them be. Give a man 100 small chances to cut corners with nobody watching, and most men will take at least a few of them. Not because they're bad men, because that's simply what happens when nobody's counting. She didn't look up from her figures. "I'm not trying to catch anyone in a lie, Mr. Calloway. I'm trying to build something where lying isn't the easiest path anymore." Nathan sat across from her, arms crossed, and found himself, not for the first time, simply watching her work. There was something steadying about it, the scratch of her pencil, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she never seemed rattled no matter what number stared back at her from the page. "My father would have hated this," he said eventually. Abigail glanced up. "Which part?" "All of it. A woman running his books, a woman telling grown men how to count their hours." He shook his head slowly. He believed a ranch owner's word was law and questioning it was disrespect. I grew up believing the same thing. And now, Nathan considered the question longer than she expected him to. "Now I think my father's word being law is exactly how $40 walked out the door in Dawson's pocket, and nobody noticed for a year. I think it's how a barn nearly burned down because nobody thought to ask whether the bucket placement made sense. I think—" He stopped searching for the rest of it. "I think being unquestionable isn't the same as being right." Abigail set down her pencil, something quiet and approving in her expression that she didn't often let show. "That's the most sensible thing I've heard you say since I arrived, Mr. Calloway." "Don't get used to it," Nathan said, and for the first time since she'd known him, something like a real smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The rustlers came for the West herd on a moonless night 11 days after Abigail's hiring was made official, and it was her own habit of walking the fence line before bed that caught them before they'd finished the job. She'd taken to checking the perimeter each evening, a small precaution she'd added to her routine without asking permission. And that particular night, she noticed something wrong. Almost immediately, a gate that should have been latched, standing open, fresh wheel ruts pressed into soft ground where no wagon had business being. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She rode back to the bunkhouse at a dead run and had Jesse and Cooper saddled and moving within minutes quiet, as she could manage cutting across the pasture toward the sound of cattle being pushed somewhere they shouldn't be going. 3 men, maybe 4, she said low, reining up at the ridge overlooking the West herd. "They've got a dozen head already separated and moving toward the county road. We need Nathan and every gun this ranch has, and we need them now, not in 20 minutes. "Ranch is a full mile back," Cooper said. "By the time we fetch him, then we slow them down ourselves until he gets here." Abigail was already moving, working her way along the ridge toward the gap in the fence, keeping low. "Jesse, ride hard for the house. Tell Nathan Westherd, tell him rustlers, tell him now. Cooper, you're with me." Jesse didn't argue. He was gone into the dark before Abigail finished the sentence, and Cooper followed her down the ridge with his rifle drawn, trusting her judgment in a way he wouldn't have believed himself capable of a month earlier. They didn't confront the rustlers outright. Abigail was too careful, too clear-eyed for that, 2 against 3 or 4 armed men in the dark, being exactly the kind of poor arithmetic she'd never allow. Instead, she worked the shadows, cutting the fence wire further down to open a second gap, driving a handful of loose cattle back through it to slow the herd. The rustlers were trying to push toward the road, buying time with nothing but patience and a clear head, while Cooper kept watch with his rifle steady. Nathan arrived 20 minutes later with 4 more hands and enough noise and gunfire into the air to send the rustlers scattering into the dark without a single shot exchanged in anger. And by the time the dust settled, the ranch had lost exactly nothing. Not 1 head of cattle, not 1 man hurt, Thanks to a woman who'd taken to walking a fence line nobody had asked her to walk. "You could have waited for me," Nathan said afterward, finding her checking the cut wire by lantern light, hands steady despite the adrenaline still working through all of them. "Could have been you out there in the dark with armed men instead of waiting safe at the house." "I could have. Then we'd have lost a dozen head of cattle waiting on me to be careful." Abigail didn't look up from the wire, twisting it back into place with quick, sure movements. "I wasn't reckless, Mr. Calloway. I was fast. Those are different things, whatever it might have looked like from where you were riding." "You scared me half to death is what you did." That got her attention. She looked up, something searching in her expression, at the rawness in his voice, at the fear he hadn't quite managed to smooth out of it. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slow. "Doesn't change the fact that it happened." Neither of them said anything else about it that night, but something had shifted again, some further inch of ground given over between them, and both of them felt it even without naming it aloud.
Mom.
Church came around that Sunday, the first time Abigail had gone into town for anything other than ranch business since her arrival, and Nathan insisted on riding in with her, though he told himself it was simply because the wagon needed a second driver. The whispering started before they'd even tied off the horses. "There's Nathan Calloway's woman," someone murmured, not quite quiet enough, and Abigail's spine went a fraction straighter, though her expression didn't change. "She's not," Nathan started, then stopped, uncertain suddenly of how he meant to finish that sentence. Uncertain whether denying it felt true anymore. "It's all right," Abigail said quietly before he could find the words. "Let them talk. Talk's cheap, and I've been the subject of it in every town I've ever lived in." Inside, a cluster of women near the front pews made no effort to hide their staring, whispering behind gloved hands, as Abigail took a seat near the back with Nathan beside her. One woman, stiff-backed and sharp-eyed, leaned toward her neighbor loud enough to carry. Imagine a woman that size running a man's whole ranch. What's Nathan Calloway thinking, letting her make a fool of him in front of the whole territory? Abigail's hands folded tighter in her lap, the only sign the words had landed at all. Nathan felt his own jaw tighten, old anger rising fast and hot, and before he could stop himself, he was on his feet. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, and his voice carried clean through the church, drawing every eye in the room. "That woman you're talking about saved my ranch from bankruptcy, caught a thief who'd been stealing from me for a year, and pulled me out from under a fallen horse with her own 2 hands. I'd wager she's done more honest work in the last 3 weeks than half this congregation's managed in a year. If you've got something to say about her, you can say it to my face instead of behind your glove." The church went dead silent. Mrs. Pruitt's face went a mottled shade of red, and she found nothing to say in return. Nathan sat back down, breathing hard, aware suddenly of every eye still on him. Aware of Abigail beside him, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between shock and something far softer. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered once the service had resumed, and the whispering had died down to something more careful. "Yes," Nathan said simply. "I did." Abigail didn't answer that, but her hand found his on the pew between them just for a moment, just long enough to mean something before she pulled it back and folded her hands properly in her lap. Once more, eyes forward, as though nothing at all had happened. That warmth didn't last the week. Nathan found her 3 nights later sitting alone on the porch steps well past midnight, staring out at nothing in particular, her shoulders drawn in on themselves in a way he hadn't seen since her first day on the ranch. "Couldn't sleep," she said before he could ask. He sat down beside her, close enough to talk quiet, far enough to give her room if she needed it. "Bramwell get to you after all? I thought you handled him fine." "I did handle him fine. That's not what's keeping me up." Abigail wrapped her arms around her knees, a gesture so unlike her usual squared-shoulder certainty that Nathan felt something twist in his chest, just watching it. "I've had 100 conversations like that one, Mr. Calloway. 1,000 maybe. Men who take one look and decide they already know everything worth knowing about me. I've gotten good at answering them, good at not letting it show on my face. But it still gets to you, every single time. She said it plainly without self-pity the way she said most things. I used to think if I worked hard enough, proved myself often enough, eventually people would stop seeing my size before they saw anything else. I'm 32 years old, Mr. Calloway. I've been proving myself since I was younger than half your hired hands. It never stops being the first thing people see. Nathan didn't have an easy answer for that, and he was smart enough not to pretend he did. I saw something else the day you stepped off that wagon, he said instead. I just didn't want to admit it because admitting it meant admitting I needed help I'd sworn I'd never need. Abigail turned to look at him, something guarded and searching in her expression. What did you see? Somebody who wasn't afraid of me. Every hand I've ever hired tiptoes around me a little, waiting to see which way my temper's going to break. You walked up to me covered in trail dust and told me plain to my face that I was wrong about you before I'd even finished being wrong. He shook his head slowly. Took me a week to understand that wasn't disrespect. That was the first honest conversation I'd had with anyone in years. Something shifted in Abigail's expression, not quite a smile, but close to it, softer than anything he'd seen from her before. You're not so bad yourself, Mr. Calloway, for a man who put his fist through a barn door the day we met. That door had it coming. I'm sure it did. She almost laughed, the sound surprising them both. Then it faded, and something more serious took its place. Thank you. For what you said to Bramwell. Most men would have let it slide, or worse, agreed with him just to avoid the trouble of disagreeing. Most men are fools, Nathan said simply. I spent 36 years being one of them. I'm not eager to go back. They sat together a while longer in the quiet, saying nothing, and neither of them moved to end it. Chateau. The following week brought its own trouble, sharper and more immediate than town gossip or a neighbor's cruelty. A stretch of fence along the north pasture had gone down in a storm, and by the time anyone noticed, nearly 40 head of cattle had wandered through the gap into rough country, thick with ravines and loose shale. Nathan rode out with 4 hands at first light, expecting a long, grinding day of tracking strays through broken ground. Abigail insisted on coming. This isn't kitchen work or ledger work, Nathan said, already knowing the argument was lost before he finished making it. It's hard riding rough country. I need you back at the ranch, not out here. You need every capable hand you can get, and I've been riding rough country since before you could walk a straight line, Mr. Calloway. She was already tightening her saddle girth as she said it. Waste your breath arguing if you like. I'm coming. She was right to come. It was Abigail who spotted the first sign, hoofprints veering off toward a narrow ravine where the ground gave way to loose shale, the kind of terrain that could break a steer's leg in a single wrong step. There, she said, pointing. Fresh enough to be this morning. They'll have gone down looking for water, and if they're still down there, we've got maybe an hour before the afternoon heat starts working against us. They found nearly 30 head clustered at the bottom of the ravine, and it was slow, careful work getting them back up the loose slope, one small group at a time. Abigail directing the effort with the same calm authority she'd shown during the fire, calling out which animals to move first, which paths held steady ground, and which would crumble under weight. It was on the final push, driving the last handful of stragglers up the steepest section, that the ground gave way beneath Nathan's horse. The animal stumbled, screamed, and went down hard on its side, throwing Nathan clear, but pinning his leg beneath its weight against the shale. Nathan? Abigail was off her own horse before it had fully stopped scrambling down the loose slope toward him, ignoring every shout from the other hands to be careful of her footing. Don't move. Don't try to pull free, you'll tear something worse. I'm fine. Nathan gritted out, though the gray tint to his face said otherwise. You are not fine, and I did not ask your opinion on the matter. Abigail reached him and threw her weight against the horse's shoulder, urging the panicked animal up and off him with a strength that startled even the hands watching from above. The horse scrambled upright, favoring one leg but standing. Nathan lay still a moment, breathing hard before Abigail's hands were on his leg, checking with quick practiced efficiency. Can you feel your foot? Yes. Wiggle your toes for me. He did, wincing. Nothing broken, just bruised to hell. That's for a doctor to decide, not you. But some of the tension left her shoulders, and when she helped him sit upright, her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than the task required. You scared 10 years off my life, Mr. Calloway. You scared them right back climbing down that slope like it was flat ground, Nathan said, breathless from more than just the fall. Could have broken your own neck. I wasn't going to leave you pinned under a horse to worry about my neck. Abigail's hazel eyes were steady on his, closer than they'd ever been close enough. That Nathan noticed things he hadn't let himself notice before the small scar above her eyebrow. The way her breath still came quick from the scramble down the ravine, the warmth of her hand still resting against his arm. For one long moment, neither of them moved. Then Cooper's voice broke the spell from up the slope, calling down to ask if the boss was still breathing, and Abigail straightened fast, pulling her hand back like she'd touched something hot. We should get you back to the ranch, she said, all business again, though a flush had crept up her neck that had nothing to do with the climbing. That leg needs looking at properly. Nathan let her help him up, and if he held onto her arm a little longer than his legs strictly required, neither of them mentioned it. The doctor confirmed nothing was broken, just deep bruising that would keep Nathan off a horse for the better part of a week. And Nathan spent those days doing something he hadn't done in years, sitting still and watching someone else run his ranch. It should have driven him half mad. Instead, he found himself almost grateful for the enforced rest, because it gave him time to watch Abigail work in a way he'd never allowed himself before, without the constant pull of his own chores demanding his attention. He watched her settle a dispute between two hands over grazing rotation without raising her voice once. He watched her catch a wheel about to come loose on the supply wagon before it could strand someone out on the range. He watched her sit with old Hollis in the evenings, going over the books together, teaching the injured foreman a system of tracking that would keep this kind of trouble from happening again once his leg healed enough for him to take the reins back. You could have my job, Nathan told her one evening, propped up on the porch with his bruised leg stretched out in front of him. Half this ranch already looks to you before they look to me. I don't want your job, Mr. Calloway. Abigail settled into the chair beside him, tired in the particular way that came from a full day's honest work. I want this ranch to run right. There's a difference between wanting authority and wanting things done properly. I've never much cared which one gets me there. That land past the North Ridge, Nathan said, suddenly the words coming out before he'd quite decided to say them. The section that doesn't get grazed. You've asked about it twice now, and I've changed the subject twice. Abigail went very still beside him. I noticed. I didn't want to push. I know you noticed. You notice everything. Nathan looked out at the darkening yard, at the shape of the mountains beyond it going purple in the last light. It's not empty because it's poor land, if that's what you've been wondering. It's empty because I made it that way. You don't have to tell me, Nathan. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the formal weight of his surname attached to it, and something in his chest tightened at the sound of it. Whatever it is, it's yours to keep or share in your own time. I know. He was quiet a long moment, turning something over that he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Not to Hollis, not to anyone who'd worked this land beside him. Someday I'll tell you, just not tonight. All right, Abigail said simply, and didn't push further. Though Nathan could see the questions still moving behind her eyes. Questions she'd earned the right to ask questions. He wasn't yet ready to answer, not even to a woman who'd already proven she could be trusted with far more than most people ever earned the chance to know. Hollis came out onto the porch a while later, legs still stiff, but the splint finally gone moving with the careful gait of a man relearning his own body after weeks of forced stillness. He lowered himself into the third chair with a grunt, and looked between the two of them for a long moment before he spoke. Figured I'd tell you both at once, he said. Doc says I'll be sound enough to ride light duty within the month, but I've been thinking on it, and I don't believe I want the foreman job back. Nathan sat up straighter. Hollis. Let me finish, Nathan. Hollis nodded toward Abigail. This ranch has run smoother in the last month than it has in the 11 years I held that title. Not because I did poor work. Because she does better work. And there's no shame in a man admitting when someone's simply better suited to a job than he is. I'll stay on. Happy to. But I wanted official Miss Harper as foreman, not just some arrangement everybody tiptoes around. Abigail looked startled for the first time in longer than Nathan could remember. Hollis, that's not necessary. I don't need the title. Maybe you don't need it, Hollis said. But every man on this ranch needs to hear it said plain, so there's no more question about whose word carries weight when Nathan's not around to give it himself. You've earned it a dozen times over. Let an old man do one useful thing before his leg gives out on him again. Nathan looked at Abigail, something warm and certain settling behind his ribs. He's right. It should be official. Abigail was quiet a moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had gone rougher than usual, thick with something she didn't often let show. All right, foreman then, if that's what you both want. It's what this ranch needs, Nathan said, which I've come to understand is usually the same thing as what's right. Hollis pushed himself back up with a groan, waving off Nathan's offer of help. Well, glad that's settled. I'm for bed before this leg reminds me exactly how old I am. He paused at the door, glancing back at the two of them sitting close together in the lamplight. Good thing you did today, boss. Both the things you did today, if you take my meaning. He left them to the quiet after that, and neither one moved to fill the silence he'd left behind. Nathan was gone before sunrise the next morning, and when Abigail found him, he was standing at the edge of the North Ridge saddled horse waiting beside him, looking out over ground he hadn't set foot on in longer than he cared to count. You're supposed to be resting that leg, she said, coming up beside him. Leg's fine enough for a slow ride. He didn't look at her. I want to show you something, if you're willing. Abigail didn't ask what. She simply swung up onto her own horse and followed him past the last fence line out toward the section of grass that had sat untouched for over a decade, the section every man on the ranch knew better than to ask questions about. They rode in silence for the better part of 20 minutes, and Nathan felt the old tightness building in his chest with every step closer. The same tightness that had kept him away from this ground for years at a stretch, sometimes riding the whole rest of the ranch just to avoid crossing this one stretch of grass. The cabin sat where it had always sat, weathered gray roof sagging in one corner, where a winter storm had caved part of it years back and nobody had ever come to fix it. A fence once white, now the color of old bone, marked off a small square of ground beside it. Abigail reined up beside him and said nothing, waiting. My parents built that cabin the year they first came out here, Nathan said finally. Before the big house, before any of it. This was the whole ranch once, just this cabin and 40 acres and more hope than sense. He swallowed hard. My sister was born in that cabin, 6 years younger than me. Her name was Charlotte. Was? Abigail said quietly. Not a question. She'd already understood the shape of it from the way he spoke. She died the winter she turned 9. Worst winter this territory's seen in 50 years. Everybody still talks about it. Snow came early, came hard, and it didn't let up for 6 straight weeks. We were snowed into that cabin, all 4 of us, and Charlotte took sick with a fever nobody could break. Nathan's voice had gone flat, the careful flatness of a man reciting something he'd told himself 1,000 times in the privacy of his own head, and never once said aloud to another living soul. My father tried to ride for the doctor in town. Turned back twice, snow too deep drifts higher than his horse. 3rd time he made it through. Doctor got here 2 days later. 2 days too late, Abigail said softly. 2 days too late. Nathan's jaw worked. I was 15. I sat up with her those last 2 nights, holding her hand, telling her stories, promising her she'd see spring. I promised her that Abigail. I looked a dying child in the eye and promised her something I had no right to promise. Abigail dismounted without a word and came to stand beside him close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his. You were 15. You didn't know what else to say. I know that now. I didn't know it then. For years I told myself if I'd ridden for the doctor myself instead of my father, if I'd been faster, stronger, if I'd done something different. His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed his lips together hard, fighting for the composure he'd built his entire adult life around. My father closed up this section after she died. Said he couldn't bear to graze cattle where his daughter took her last breath. I inherited that same feeling, along with everything else he left me. Never questioned it. Never let anyone else question it either, until I asked twice, and you changed the subject twice. Until you asked twice, and I changed the subject twice. He finally looked at her eyes, red-rimmed in a way he didn't try to hide. You're the first person I've brought out here since my father's funeral. I don't rightly know why I chose today. I think you know exactly why, Abigail said gently. You've been carrying this alone for 21 years, Nathan. A person can only carry a thing alone for so long before the weight of it starts crushing something else besides the grief. I think some part of you has been waiting for someone patient enough to wait until you were ready to set part of it down. Nathan let out a breath that shook more than he wanted it to. That obvious? To me, yes. I don't imagine it's obvious to most people. Most people don't look closely enough to notice a man's been drowning quietly for 2 decades under the weight of 40 untouched acres. He turned to face her fully, then something raw and unguarded in his expression that she'd never seen from him before, not even during the fire, not even pinned beneath his own horse. Why do you look that closely, I mean? Most people don't bother. Abigail was quiet a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the sagging cabin roof, toward the fence, gone the color of bone. Because I know what it costs to carry something alone that long. My mother never recovered from losing that ranch, Nathan. Not really. She died 3 years after the bank took it, and I've always believed some part of what killed her wasn't sickness at all. It was carrying the shame of it by herself for too long, refusing help from anyone, including me, because asking felt like admitting the failure was real instead of temporary. Her voice roughened. I made myself a promise after she died. I'd never let pride keep me quiet about what I was carrying, and I'd never again stand by and watch someone else do the same thing to themselves without at least trying to help. Is that what I am to you? Nathan asked, quieter now. Someone to help another version of your mother. You get a chance to save this time. The question landed harder than he meant it to, and he watched something flicker across Abigail's face. Hurt quickly, smoothed over, replaced with the same steady patience she wore for everything. No, she said simply. That's not what you are to me at all. And I think you know that, or you wouldn't have asked the question in that particular tone, half hoping I'd say something else. Nathan looked away, first jaw tight, something in his chest too full and too tender to examine directly. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. No, it wasn't. But I understand why you asked it. A man doesn't stand in front of his sister's deathbed for the first time in years and come out the other side saying only fair things. Abigail reached out careful and rested her hand against his arm, the way she had in the ravine, warm and steady. I'm not here because I need someone to save Nathan Calloway. I'm here because somewhere between that first supply room and this cabin, I stopped seeing you as a job I was hired to fix. Nathan's breath caught. What do you see me as now? Abigail didn't answer right away. She looked at him a long moment, hazel eyes searching his face like she was memorizing something she intended to keep, and then slow enough that he had every chance to step back if he wanted to. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It lasted only a moment. When she pulled back, uncertainty flickered across her features for the first time since he'd known her, the closest thing to fear he'd ever seen on her face. I shouldn't have. Nathan cut her off by kissing her again, longer this time. One hand coming up to cradle her jaw like she was something rare and worth being careful with. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing unsteady, and something in Nathan's chest had cracked open wider than it had in 21 years, letting light into a place that had been sealed shut since a winter that took his sister and half his ability to trust the world. Don't apologize for that, he said, voice rough. Not ever. Abigail laughed short, and startled tears standing bright in her eyes that she blinked back fast. 21 years you've been carrying all this, and the first thing you say after I kiss you is an order not to apologize. I've never been much good with the pretty words, only the plain ones. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so gentle it didn't match anything the men on his ranch would have recognized as Nathan Calloway. "But I mean it plain enough. Don't apologize. Not for that, not for anything you've done since you stepped off that stagecoach." They stood together at the edge of the ridge a while longer, the cabin behind them, the whole rest of the ranch spread out below, and for the first time since Charlotte's death, Nathan didn't feel the ground beneath that cabin as something to be avoided. He felt it as something finally carefully being shared. The peace didn't last past supper. Jesse came riding in hard. Just as the sun dropped low, dust kicked up behind his horse in a way that told Nathan trouble was coming before the boy even opened his mouth. "Boss?" Jesse swung down, breathless. "There's a man from the Territorial Bank waiting up at the house. Says his business is urgent. Won't state it to anybody but you. Size." Nathan exchanged a glance with Abigail, the warmth of the afternoon draining fast out of both their faces. "Banks never sent a man out here in my whole life. Father dealt with them by mail when he dealt with them at all. He's not a friendly sort, boss. I'd get up there quick." The banker was a thin, sharp-faced man named Elias Reed, and he didn't bother with pleasantries once Nathan reached the porch, Abigail a half-step behind him. "Mr. Calloway, I'll come straight to it since I understand your time's valuable." Reed produced a folded document from his coat, holding it out. "This ranch carries a debt against the deed dating back 9 years taken out by your late father against 40 acres in the north section. The note's coming due in full within 30 days, and given the current state of the ranch's finances, I've been instructed to inform you that the bank does not expect the sum can be met." Nathan stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. "That's not possible. My father never took a loan against this land. He'd have sooner burned it down than mortgage a single acre. I understand it's a surprise, Mr. Calloway, but the signature on this note has been verified. 9 years ago against the north section, I believe you referred to it as the old homestead ground." Reed's expression didn't shift professional and cold. 30 days, sir. If the debt isn't satisfied, the bank will be forced to move toward foreclosure on that portion of the property and potentially the ranch as a whole, depending on how the original terms were structured." Abigail stepped forward before Nathan could find his voice, taking the document from Reed's hand and scanning it with the same sharp attention she brought to every ledger she'd ever opened. Her eyes moved fast down the page, and Nathan watched something tighten in her jaw as she read. "Mr. Reed," she said slowly, "this signature. You said it was verified. By the bank's own records, yes. By whom specifically? Who verified it?" Reed hesitated, the first crack in his composure. "The loan officer who originated the note, a Mr. Garrett, acting in a secondary capacity for the bank at the time, as he sometimes does for local transactions of this size." The name landed like a struck match. Nathan felt something go cold and sharp in his chest, and beside him, Abigail's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness she wore when she'd already worked out an answer she didn't like. "Garrett," Nathan repeated. "The same Garrett I stopped buying feed corn from 3 weeks ago on account of his prices." "I couldn't speak to that, Mr. Calloway. I only handle the paperwork on my end." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "I'll leave the document with you. 30 days, sir. I'd suggest speaking with a lawyer if you intend to contest it." He tipped his hat and was gone within minutes, leaving Nathan standing on his own porch, holding a piece of paper that threatened to take away the one piece of ground he'd never once considered losing. Not because it made him money, but because it held the last of his sister in every square foot of untouched grass. "He forged it," Abigail said the moment Reed's wagon disappeared down the road. "Nathan, look at this signature again." She spread the document flat on the kitchen table, and Nathan leaned over it, his hands shaking with an anger he hadn't felt since the day he put his fist through the barn door. "That's not my father's hand," he said. "I'd know his hand anywhere. He crossed his sevens a particular way always every single time. This signature doesn't cross them at all. I noticed the same thing." Abigail pulled out 3 other documents from Nathan's own ledger box, old receipts bearing his father's genuine signature, laying them side by side with the forged note. The difference was plain. Once a person knew to look for it, subtle but real. The kind of forgery good enough to fool a busy bank clerk, but not good enough to fool a man's own son, or a woman trained to notice exactly this kind of small, costly deception. This is Garrett's revenge, Nathan. You cost him a fair piece of business 3 weeks ago publicly in front of half the town. This is how he's paying you back. 9 years ago, though. Nathan's mind raced, trying to make the pieces fit. How does a man forge a note 9 years in the past and have it wait patiently until exactly the moment he wants to use it? He doesn't wait for the perfect moment by accident. He's likely been holding this note quietly for years in case he ever needed leverage against your family. Men like Garrett collect that kind of insurance the way other men collect cattle. Abigail's voice had gone hard, the calm competence she brought to everything, now sharpened into something closer to fury on Nathan's behalf. He probably assumed you'd never notice or never think to question it, because why would a grieving family ever go looking for reasons to distrust a note bearing their own father's name? He miscalculated one thing. What's that? He didn't count on you hiring someone whose entire God-given talent is noticing what other people miss. Nathan almost laughed, despite the fear still sitting cold in his stomach. 30 days isn't much time to prove a 9-year-old forgery in front of a territorial bank, Abigail. Reed's not going to take my word against a filed document, not when the alternative means admitting the bank's own paperwork was compromised. Then we won't ask him to take your word for it. We'll give him proof instead. Abigail was already moving, pulling more of Nathan's father's old papers from the ledger box, spreading them across the table with quick, purposeful hands. Every genuine document your father ever signed. Every letter, every receipt, every contract. We build a case out of consistency, Nathan, a pattern so clear that no reasonable bank examiner could look at that forged note and still call it authentic. And if that's not enough... Abigail looked up at him. Something fierce and unshakable in her expression that steadied him more than any promise could have. Then we find whoever helped Garrett file it, and we make them tell the truth in front of witnesses who matter. I've watched dishonest men unravel before, Nathan. They rarely hold together once enough pressure gets applied in the right place. We simply need to find the right place. Nathan reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture unplanned, born entirely out of the sudden, overwhelming need to touch something steady in the middle of everything threatening to come apart. 20 minutes ago, I was standing on that ridge, feeling like the happiest man in this territory. Now, I'm looking at losing the one piece of ground that matters more to me than anything else I own. You're not going to lose it, Abigail said, gripping his hand back, fierce and certain. I didn't come all this way, fight through everything I've fought through on this ranch to watch a man like Garrett take the last of your sister's memory out from under you over a debt he invented himself. We have 30 days. That's enough time if we use every single one of them wisely. They worked past midnight that first night, and every night after, spreading documents across the kitchen table until the old wood was nearly buried beneath years of receipts, letters, and contracts, building a paper trail thick enough to bury Garrett's forgery under the sheer weight of contradicting evidence. Hollis joined them on the third night leg, finally strong enough to sit a full evening at the table, adding his own memory of the ranch's finances from years spent handling half the bookwork himself. I remember the year that notes dated, Hollis said, squinting at the forged document under lamplight. 9 years back. That was the year your father bought the new bull from the Hendricks outfit, paid cash on the spot. I was there when he counted it out. A man doesn't pay cash for a prize bull the same year he's desperate enough to mortgage his dead daughter's homestead ground. Doesn't make a lick of sense. Write that down, Abigail said immediately, already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. Exact date if you remember it. Witnesses if any of the Hendricks family are still in the territory. That's precisely the kind of contradiction that unravels a forged timeline. Cooper and Jesse took turns riding into Larkspur over the following week, quietly asking around at Abigail's careful direction, gathering names of anyone who might remember dealings with Garrett from that same period. Anyone who might have seen something, heard something, noticed the particular kind of small dishonesty Garrett seemed practiced at hiding. Jesse found Old Man Hendricks himself on the 4th day, living quiet on a small spread 2 hours' ride east, and the old rancher didn't need much convincing once he understood what was being asked of him. Course I remember that bull, Hendricks said, settling into a chair on his own porch while Jesse waited with his hat in his hands. Finest animal I ever bred. Nathan's father rode out here himself, counted the cash into my palm bill. Bill wouldn't hear of a payment plan, even though I offered one. Man had pride about paying his own way, always did. He shook his head slowly. Heard talk in town about some note against the Calloway place. Didn't make sense to me the moment I heard it. A man doesn't pay cash for a prize bull the same season he's drowning in debt bad enough to mortgage sacred ground. Would you put that in writing, Mr. Hendricks? Jesse asked. Sworn if a judge asks for it. Son, I'll ride into that courtroom myself and say it to the judge's face if it helps Nathan Calloway keep what's rightfully his. Garrett's had a reputation for sharp dealing longer than you've been alive. Somebody ought to have called him on it years ago. Hendricks reached for pen and paper without further prompting, and within the hour Jesse rode back toward the ranch with one more piece of the case tucked safely inside his coat. What they found piece by piece painted a picture uglier than even Nathan had expected. Garrett had a history, a widow 2 counties over, who'd lost grazing rights to a suspicious note 8 years back, a small rancher near the county line who'd sold out cheap after Garrett called in a debt nobody could quite explain the origin of. None of it had ever been proven. All of it taken together formed exactly the pattern of a man who used forged paper the way other men used a gun. He's done this before, Abigail said, laying out the accumulated evidence one evening nearly 2 weeks into their 30 days. Which means he's gotten away with it before. Which means he'll be confident we can't touch him now either. That confidence is the one advantage we have left. A confident man gets careless. Careless how? Nathan asked. We're going to find out. Abigail's eyes had a glint in them Nathan had come to recognize over the past weeks, the particular sharp focus she wore right before she solved a problem nobody else on the ranch had been able to crack. I intend to visit Garrett's mercantile myself tomorrow. Alone without you, without Jesse, without anyone he might expect trouble from. Absolutely not, Nathan said immediately. Not after what he's already tried. If he's capable of forging a note against my father, there's no telling what he's capable of doing to you directly. He's not capable of doing anything to me in the middle of his own store in broad daylight in front of half his customers, Nathan. That would be a far bigger risk to him than anything he's already taken. Abigail's voice was calm, but there was no room in it for argument. I need to see how he reacts when I mention the bull the exact date the Hendricks family by name. A guilty man's face tells you things his mouth never will if you know precisely what to watch for. Nathan wanted to refuse outright every protective instinct in him, rebelling against the idea of sending her into that confrontation alone. But he'd learned enough over the past weeks to know when her judgment outmatched his own fear, and this he understood with a familiar, uncomfortable clarity was exactly one of those times. Take Jesse in the wagon at least, he said finally, waiting outside, not inside. If anything goes wrong, Jesse can fetch you faster than I could myself. Abigail softened, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I'm not reckless, Nathan. I told you that once already, and I meant it. I'll be careful, but we're running out of days, and careful sometimes has to make room for necessary. Nathan studied her a long moment, torn between fear and the fierce pride swelling underneath it. The particular pride of watching someone he loved walk toward danger with her chin up, and her mind already 3 steps ahead of the threat. All right, he said finally. But if you're not back by supper, I'm riding into town myself, and Garrett won't like what happens after that. Abigail almost smiled, though the seriousness of what lay ahead kept it from reaching all the way. Understood, Mr. Calloway. I'll try not to make you follow through on that particular threat. She rode into Larkspur the next morning with the documented evidence tucked carefully into her satchel, and every piece of Garrett's ugly history committed to memory, and by the time she reached the mercantile, her hands had gone perfectly steady. The last of her own fear folded away somewhere Nathan would never have to see. Garrett looked up from behind his counter, and something flickered across his face at the sight of her. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first thin edge of it. Miss Harper, Didn't expect to see you back so soon, given how our last conversation ended." "I imagine you didn't," Abigail said, setting her satchel down on the counter with deliberate slowness. "I wanted to ask you about a bull, Mr. Garrett. Purchased from the Hendricks outfit 9 years back, paid for in full in cash. The same year a certain forged note claims Nathan Calloway's father was too desperate to keep from mortgaging his own daughter's grave." Garrett's face went very still, and in that stillness, Abigail found exactly the confirmation she'd come looking for. "I don't know anything about a bull," he said too quickly. His voice pitched a shade higher than it had been a moment before. "That's odd," Abigail said, opening her satchel and withdrawing the first of the documents, laying it flat on the counter between them. "Because Hollis remembers the purchase clearly. Cash paid in full the same season your note claims Nathan's father was desperate enough to mortgage his daughter's grave to a bank he'd never once done business with in 20 years of ranching. Strange thing for a careful man to forget. Don't you think Mr. Garrett a prize bull paid for in cash the very year he supposedly couldn't cover a debt?" A few customers near the dry goods shelves had gone quiet, sensing the shift in the air, the way people always did, right before something broke open. "You're accusing me of something serious, Miss Harper. I'd be careful with words like that in a public place." "I'm not accusing you of anything yet, Mr. Garrett. I'm simply laying out facts and watching how a man reacts to them." Abigail set down a second document, the widow's account from 2 counties over, gathered patiently by Cooper over the past week. "This is a sworn statement from a woman named Louisa Fenwick, describing a note remarkably similar to the one currently threatening the Calloway Ranch. Different names. Same handwriting on the signature line, according to 3 separate people who've compared them." Garrett's composure cracked fully now, color draining from his face. Those are old grievances, Miss Harper, bitter people looking to blame someone for their own poor management. 2 separate ranches, Mr. Garrett. 2 separate forged notes, both benefiting the same bank you handle local paperwork for, both surfacing at exactly the moment it suited you to have leverage over a family you had reason to resent. Abigail's voice never rose, never wavered, and that steadiness seemed to unsettle Garrett more than shouting ever could have. "I've spent 3 weeks building this case with more patience than you apparently expected anyone to have. I'd suggest you start considering how this looks to a territorial judge, because I intend to make certain one sees every piece of it." "You can't prove any of this," Garrett said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed exactly how little he believed his own words. "I don't need to prove all of it, Mr. Garrett. I only need to prove enough of it to make a judge start asking the same questions I'm asking you right now. And once a man like Elias Reed realizes his bank's own paperwork has been compromised by a forger operating under their trust, I doubt very much he'll stand behind you simply out of loyalty." Abigail gathered the documents back into her satchel, unhurried, giving him every chance to speak while he still could. "You have one opportunity here, Mr. Garrett. Withdraw the note yourself quietly before this reaches a judge, and perhaps you keep your business and your reputation mostly intact. Force this into a courtroom, and I promise you every ugly detail comes out in front of the whole territory, not just the Calloway Ranch's business." Garrett said nothing for a long moment, his jaw working, calculating odds the way a cornered man always does when the walls close in faster than he expected. "Get out of my store," he said, finally low and furious, though there was no real force behind it anymore, only the hollow anger of a man who knew he'd already lost more ground than he could afford to lose. "Gladly," Abigail said, closing her satchel with a soft, final click. "You have until Friday to decide which version of this story you'd prefer the territory to hear, Mr. Garrett. I'd think carefully. I don't believe you'll enjoy either outcome nearly as much as you enjoyed forging that first note." She turned and walked out without waiting for a response, aware of every eye in the store following her, aware of the particular silence that settles over a room after something true has finally been said out loud. Jesse was waiting with the wagon exactly where she'd left him, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know before she'd said a single word. "Well?" he asked, snapping the reins the moment she settled beside him. "He's frightened," Abigail said, watching the mercantile shrink behind them as the wagon pulled away. "A frightened man makes mistakes, Mr. Cobb. We simply need to be patient enough to let him make the next one. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun had dropped low enough to paint the whole yard gold, and Nathan was waiting on the porch exactly where she'd left him that morning, tension carved into every line of his face, until he saw her step down from the wagon, whole and unharmed. He crossed the yard in a handful of long strides and pulled her into his arms, before either of them said a word, holding her the way a man holds something he'd genuinely feared losing. "You're all right," he said into her hair. More statement than question, though relief shook underneath it. "I'm all right." Abigail let herself lean into him a moment, allowing the exhaustion of the day to show, now that she no longer had to hold her face steady for Garrett's benefit. "He knows we have him, Nathan. I gave him until Friday to withdraw the note himself quietly, or watch it come apart in front of a judge instead. Will he take it? I don't know." She pulled back enough to look up at him, hazel eyes tired but certain. "Frightened men don't always choose the sensible path, Nathan. Sometimes they choose to fight harder instead, especially when they've got as much to lose as Garrett does if this reaches a courtroom. We should prepare for both possibilities." Nathan's jaw tightened, the old protective anger rising fast beneath his relief. "If he comes at you again, Abigail, I won't be as patient as you were today. I know." She rested her palm against his chest, feeling the fast beat of his heart beneath her hand. "But today, at least we bought ourselves time. And time right now is worth more to us than anything else Garrett could throw our way." They stood together in the gold evening light a moment longer, neither one certain yet whether Friday would bring relief or a fight neither of them had fully prepared for. Friday came slow, every hour of it stretched thin with waiting, and by mid-afternoon, Nathan had worn a path in the porch boards pacing while Abigail forced herself to sit still at the kitchen table, going over the same documents for the 10th time, though she'd long since memorized every line of them. The rider came just past 4, and it wasn't Garrett. Elias Reed dismounted stiff and formal as ever, but something in his bearing had shifted since their last meeting, a careful discomfort that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Calloway, Miss Harper." He nodded to each of them in turn, then produced a fresh document from his coat, this one bearing an official bank seal. "I'll speak plainly, since I understand this has been a difficult month for your household. The note against the north section has been withdrawn. Mr. Garrett came to the bank yesterday evening and formally recanted the debt, citing an administrative error in the original filing." Nathan's breath left him in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Withdrawn. Just like that." "Not entirely just like that, Mr. Calloway. The bank conducted its own review once certain irregularities were brought to our attention." Reed's eyes flicked briefly toward Abigail, something almost like respect in the gesture. "Mr. Garrett's role in originating several notes over the years has come under closer scrutiny than he apparently anticipated. I won't pretend to know the full extent of what will come of that scrutiny. But I can tell you, the bank does not intend to extend him further trust in matters of local paperwork." "He's done then," Abigail said, "as a banking agent." "I couldn't say for certain, Miss Harper, but I'd imagine his usefulness to this institution has reached its natural end." Reed handed over the withdrawal document, formal and final. "The land is yours free and clear, Mr. Calloway. I apologize for the trouble this caused your family. Had I known the note's origins were compromised, I never would have ridden out here in the first place." Nathan took the document with hands that weren't quite steady, reading it twice before he let himself believe it. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." "Thank Miss Harper," Reed said, already turning back toward his horse. "I've handled banking business in this territory 11 years, and I don't believe I've seen anyone build a case against forged paper with half the precision she managed in under 3 weeks. Good day to you both." The moment his horse disappeared down the road, Nathan turned and pulled Abigail into his arms, lifting her clean off her feet in a way that startled a laugh out of both of them. "It's over," he said, setting her back down, but not letting go. "The land's ours. Charlotte's ground is ours. It was always yours, Nathan. Garrett just tried to convince the world otherwise." Abigail's eyes were bright relief and exhaustion mixing in equal measure. "We simply made certain the truth caught up to him before the lie did any real damage." Cooper and Jesse came running from the barn at the sound of Nathan's whoop of relief, and within minutes the whole yard had gathered hands, and all word of the withdrawal spreading through the ranch faster than Nathan could have told it himself. "Knew it," Cooper said, grinning wide. "Knew the moment Miss Harper rode into town with that satchel full of papers, Garrett didn't stand a chance in hell." "Language," Abigail said, though there was no real heat in it, just the easy warmth of a woman too relieved to hold anyone to strict account tonight. Hollis limped over from the bunkhouse, leaning on his cane more for show than necessity these days, and clasped Nathan's hand with a firmness that spoke louder than words. "Your father would be proud, son. Not just of keeping the land, of how you kept it." Nathan felt something thick rise in his throat at that, unable to answer right away, and Abigail's hand found his shoulder steady and warm, giving him the moment he needed without drawing attention to it. "Somebody ought to break out whatever whiskey's left in that bunkhouse," Jesse said. "Feels like a night worth toasting." "One drink," Nathan said, finding his voice again. "We've still got cattle to tend come morning, whiskey or no whiskey." But he said it smiling, and the whole yard laughed with him, and for the first time in longer than Nathan could remember, the sound of his own ranch celebrating something good, instead of surviving something bad, rang out clear into the evening air. Chapiyik. Word of Garrett's disgrace moved through Larkspur faster than any news the town had carried in years. And by Sunday the whispers that had once mocked Abigail had curdled entirely into something aimed at the mercantile owner instead. The mercantile sat half empty the following week, customers drifting toward suppliers 2 towns over, rather than trust a man now known to have forged notes against his own neighbors. Garrett himself was seen only rarely, his usual bluster gone thin and brittle, and within a month the store changed hands entirely. Sold quiet and quick to a family from Cheyenne looking for a fresh start. Nathan felt no particular satisfaction watching it happen. If anything, the whole affair left him more unsettled than triumphant, a reminder of how close pride and unchecked trust had come to costing him everything that mattered. "You're quiet tonight," Abigail said, finding him on the porch a week after Reed's visit, staring out at the darkening yard with a stillness she'd learned to read as trouble brewing beneath the surface. "Just thinking." Nathan shifted to make room for her beside him. "My father trusted that man 20 years, never once questioned him. And in the end, it nearly cost us everything he built, all because nobody thought to look closely enough at what we were being told. That's not a failure particular to your father, Nathan. That's simply what happens when trust goes unexamined long enough. Most people never get caught the way Garrett did. Most people just keep taking small advantages nobody ever notices, year after year, until it's too late to matter." Abigail settled beside him, her shoulder warm against his. "You caught it. That's the part worth sitting with, not the part where it almost happened." "I didn't catch it. You did. We caught it." She corrected, echoing words he'd said to her once during the fire, and something in the shared memory eased the tightness in his chest better than any argument could have. "This ranch doesn't run on one person's back anymore, Nathan. That was the whole point of everything these past 2 months." He turned to look at her, something steady and certain settling into place behind his ribs. "I want to do something with that land, Charlotte's ground. I don't want it sitting empty forever, a monument to grief nobody gets any good from." Abigail went still beside him, listening carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet exactly. Something that honors her without just being 40 acres of silence." Nathan looked out at the ridge, invisible now in the dark, but present all the same in his mind's eye. "Maybe a school. This territory's growing more families coming every season, and the nearest schoolhouse is a 2-hour ride for half the children out this way." Charlotte loved reading, loved stories. Seems like the kind of thing she'd have wanted that ground used for instead of just standing empty. Something bright and fierce moved across Abigail's face. Pride and tenderness both at once. "That's a beautiful idea, Nathan." "Only decided on it about 30 seconds ago," he admitted. "But it feels right. Feels like the kind of thing that turns grief into something that actually helps somebody, instead of just letting it sit there hurting nobody but me." "Then we'll make it happen," Abigail said, and the word we settled between them like something already decided, already permanent in a way, Neither of them felt the need to question further. The cattle auction fell 3 weeks later, the largest gathering the territory saw each year, ranchers coming from 4 counties over to buy and sell and size up whose herd had fared best through the season. Nathan hadn't planned to say anything beyond the usual business of bidding, but Bramwell made that impossible within the first hour. "Heard your fat foreman's been running your whole operation now, Calloway," Bramwell called out loud enough to draw attention from half the yard, emboldened by a few other ranchers laughing along beside him. "Whole territory's still talking about it. Man can't even bid on his own cattle without checking with her first, I'd wager." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd, the kind that comes from people unsure whether it's safe to laugh or not. Nathan set down the ledger he'd been holding and walked to the center of the auction yard. Unhurried, deliberate, every eye in the place following him. "You're right about one thing, Otis," he said, voice carrying clean across the yard the way it had in church weeks earlier. "I do check with her. Every decision this ranch has made in the last 2 months, I've checked with her first, because she's proven smarter about running cattle managing books and catching thieves than any man I've ever hired in 15 years of ranching, myself included." The laughter died fast. 2 months ago, my ranch was falling apart. Foreman down, cook gone, hired hands, stealing wages and running off debts. Nobody had bothered to check in years. I was 3 days from losing everything my father built, and too proud to admit any of it out loud. Nathan's eyes swept the crowd, finding faces he recognized, faces that had laughed at Abigail the day she stepped off that stagecoach. Then a woman answered my advertisement. A woman half this yard decided wasn't worth hiring before she'd said a single word based on nothing but the size of her. That woman caught a thief in her first week, saved my barn from burning to the ground, uncovered a forged note that nearly cost my family the last piece of ground that held my sister's memory, and built a system on my ranch that runs better today than it has in the 11 years since my father died. Nobody spoke. Bramwell's face had gone a dull, uncomfortable red. "The smartest person on my ranch isn't me," Nathan said, and his voice didn't waver once. "It's the woman every one of you laughed at when she stepped off that stagecoach 3 months back. If any man here still has something ugly to say about her size, say it to my face right now, because I'd rather settle it plain in this yard than hear it whispered behind my back for another season." Silence held the whole auction yard for a long, taut moment. Then, from somewhere near the back, an older rancher named Silas Woodrow started clapping, slow and deliberate, and one by one others joined him, until the yard filled with applause that had nothing to do with cattle prices, and everything to do with a man finally saying out loud what half the territory had already come to believe on their own. Bramwell said nothing. He mounted his horse and rode out without another word, and nobody in that yard seemed particularly sorry to see him go. Abigail heard about the auction before Nathan even made it back to the ranch, the story having outrun his horse, thanks to Cooper's excited retelling to every hand within earshot. She was waiting on the porch when he rode in. Arms crossed, expression unreadable, in a way that made his stomach tighten with sudden uncertainty. "You didn't have to do that," she said, echoing the same words from church weeks earlier. "Yes?" Nathan said, echoing his own answer right back. "I did. The whole territory is going to be talking about it by morning." "Let them talk." Nathan dismounted, closing the distance between them. "I'm done being quiet about what I know to be true, Abigail. You saved this ranch. You saved me, if I'm honest about it, dragged me up out of 21 years of drowning in my own pride and grief. I'm not interested in staying quiet about that, just to keep peace with men like Bramwell." Abigail's composure finally cracked, something wet and bright standing in her eyes that she didn't bother blinking away this time. "Nobody has ever defended me like that. Not once in 32 years has a single person stood up in front of a crowd and said my worth out loud the way you just did." "Then it was long past due," Nathan said, simply reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek, with a gentleness that belied every rough edge the rest of the territory saw in him. "You've spent your whole life proving yourself to people who never deserved the effort. I don't want to be one more person you have to prove anything to. I already know exactly what you're worth." Abigail closed the last of the distance between them, and kissed him fierce and grateful and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, and Nathan held her like he intended to keep holding her for a very long time. Church that following Sunday looked different than it had the last time Abigail walked through its doors. Mrs. Pruitt of all people was waiting near the entrance when they arrived, hands twisted together in front of her in a way that suggested she'd been working up her courage for some time. "Miss Harper." Mrs. Pruitt's voice came out stiffer than she likely intended, pride and shame warring visibly across her face. "I owe you an apology. What I said in this church some weeks back was cruel, and worse than cruel, it was wrong. I've heard what you've done for the Callaway Ranch. For this whole territory, if what happened with Garrett is any measure, I should have looked closer before I opened my mouth." Abigail studied her a moment, weighing the sincerity of it the way she weighed everything, and found it genuine enough to accept. "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt. That took some courage to say." "Less courage than it took for your Nathan to stand up in this church and say what he said." Mrs. Pruitt managed a thin, embarrassed smile. "My husband's been reminding me of it every day, since whether I wanted reminding or not." "He wasn't wrong to remind you," Abigail said, but she said it gently, and Mrs. Pruitt seemed to understand there was no lingering malice behind the words. Nathan watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, and later walking back to the wagon, he found himself smiling in a way that had become far more natural to him over the past months than it had ever been before. "Feels different, doesn't it?" he said. "Walking through this town now." "Feels earned," Abigail corrected. "Which is a different thing than different, though I suppose the two aren't entirely separate either." Nathan rode into Cheyenne alone the following week, telling Abigail only that he had ranch business to attend to, business that required a full day's ride each way and couldn't wait for the regular supply run. She didn't press him on it, though he caught her studying him with open curiosity more than once before he left. He found the jeweler's shop on the 2nd Street off the main square, small and unassuming, and spent the better part of an hour going through cases of rings with a patience that would have surprised every hand on his ranch, none of whom had ever seen Nathan Callaway spend more than 5 minutes deciding anything. "Something simple," he told the jeweler, an older man with careful hands and kind eyes. "She's not one for excess, doesn't want things that draw attention to themselves, but it needs to be solid. Built to last the way she is." The jeweler showed him a band of gold set with a single modest stone, unfussy but well made, and Nathan knew within seconds of seeing it that he'd found the right one. "For a wife?" the jeweler asked, wrapping it carefully. "For the only person who's ever looked at my whole life, every broken piece of it, and decided it was worth staying for anyway," Nathan said, and the jeweler, who'd heard every manner of answer to that question over 30 years in the trade, paused a moment at the particular weight behind this one. "Then I hope she says yes, sir." "So do I," Nathan admitted, tucking the small box carefully into his coat pocket, close against his chest, the whole ride home, as though he could somehow protect it and everything it meant simply by keeping it near. He confided in Hollis the following evening, unable to hold the secret entirely alone, finding the old foreman mending a bridle on the bunkhouse porch in the day's last light. "Bought a ring in Cheyenne," Nathan said, without much preamble, dropping into the chair beside him. Hollis didn't look up from the bridle right away, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "Took you long enough. Man have to be blind not to see this coming since the night that barn caught fire." "That obvious. Son, the whole ranch has been placing bets on it for 2 months now. Jesse's got money riding on before harvest. Cooper thinks you'll wait till Christmas, fool that he is." Hollis finally set the bridle down, studying Nathan, with something warm and fatherly in his weathered face. "Your own father would have approved of her, you know. Took him a while to warm to your mother, too, if the old stories are true. Man like your father never trusted anybody easy. But once he did, he trusted them all the way. Sounds to me like you inherited that particular trait, even if it took a burning barn and a forged note to bring it out of you." Nathan turned the small box over in his coat pocket, feeling the weight of it settle differently now that someone else knew it was there. "How do I ask her, Hollis? She's not a woman who's impressed by pretty speeches. Never has been." "Then don't give her one." Hollis picked his bridle back up, returning to his work with the easy practicality of a man who'd seen enough of life to know most of its hardest questions, had simple answers underneath all the worry people piled on top of them. Just tell her the truth, plain as you know how. She's spent her whole life proving her worth to people who never deserved the effort. Seems to me the kindest thing you could do is make sure she never has to prove it to you. Not for one single day of whatever years you've got left together. Nathan sat with that a long moment, the evening settling gold and quiet around them, and found for the first time since he'd carried that small box out of the jeweler's shop that the nervousness in his chest had eased into something closer to certainty. The weeks that followed brought a different kind of work to the ranch, quieter, but no less demanding. Abigail's plan moved forward piece by piece, the poorest grazing land sold off to a young family, looking to start their own smaller operation, the money reinvested in better breeding stock that would pay dividends for years. Dishonest suppliers were replaced with fair ones. Hard-working hands received raises long overdue, and two older men nearing the end of their working years were quietly offered retirement with dignity instead of being pushed out once their bodies could no longer keep pace. Old Amos Whitfield, who'd broken horses for the Callaway outfit since before Nathan was born, wept openly when Nathan told him the terms: a small cabin near the main house, a modest pension for the rest of his days, and standing permission to keep a hand in the work whenever his health allowed it, without ever being made to feel he owed the ranch another day of labor he couldn't give. "Your father would have worked me till I dropped dead in a saddle," Amos said, voice thick. Never once occurred to him a man might deserve rest after giving 40 years to a place. "It occurred to somebody," Nathan said, glancing toward Abigail, who stood a respectful distance away, letting the moment belong to the two men alone. "Took me long enough to listen. I'm listening now, and I intend to keep listening for as long as this ranch stands." The barn's east wall, scorched from the fire months earlier, finally got rebuilt stronger than before, with a new bucket station installed exactly where Abigail had moved the old one, a small permanent reminder of the night she'd saved it from burning entirely. And out past the North Ridge, surveyors Nathan hired from Cheyenne began marking the ground for a schoolhouse, careful to leave the old cabin standing untouched at the edge of the new plot, a quiet monument beside something finally purposefully alive. The town turned out for the groundbreaking on a bright Saturday morning, more people than Nathan had expected, word having spread of what the Callaway Ranch intended to build on ground the whole territory had long assumed would stay empty forever. Families came out from Larkspur in wagons loaded with children, curious to see the schoolhouse their sons and daughters would no longer have to ride 2 hours to reach. Silas Woodrow, the old rancher who'd started the applause at the cattle auction, brought a crate of tools as a gift, refusing payment when Nathan tried to offer it. "Consider it my apology for every year I let this territory go without a proper school close enough for these families to use. Ought to have been built a decade ago. Glad somebody finally had the sense to do it." Even Mrs. Pruitt came standing at the edge of the gathering with a basket of preserves for the workers watching, with an expression that had softened considerably since her apology weeks earlier. Abigail stood beside Nathan as the first stake went into the ground, marking the corner of what would become the schoolhouse's foundation, and something in her expression carried a depth Nathan hadn't seen from her before. Not just pride in the work, but something closer to belonging. The particular look of a woman who'd spent her whole life being tolerated in places and was only now, for the first time, being genuinely welcomed. "You've gone quiet," Nathan said, low enough for only her to hear. "I'm thinking about my mother," Abigail admitted. "She'd have loved a moment like this. A whole town coming together to build something good instead of standing by and watching something fall apart out of pride." Her voice caught slightly. "I wish she could have seen it, any of it. This ranch, this town, the two of us." Nathan took her hand right there in front of the whole gathered crowd, unbothered by who might see or what they might say about it. Maybe she is seeing it in whatever way people do see things once they're gone. I like to think Charlotte's watching too. Would have liked nothing better than a school full of children learning to read on the very ground she used to run across as a girl. Abigail squeezed his hand, tears standing bright in her eyes that she didn't bother hiding. This time, not in front of a crowd that had finally learned to see her clearly. "Then I suppose we're building this for more than just the living Nathan. Seems fitting given everything it took to get here. They stayed through the whole afternoon watching the first timbers go up, watching children who would someday fill that schoolhouse chase each other across the very ground that had sat silent and grieving for over 2 decades. And Nathan found himself more than once simply watching Abigail instead of the construction. The easy way she'd settled into this community that had once mocked her on sight. The quiet joy she took in watching something good get built instead of something broken get uncovered. You're building it close to the cabin, Abigail observed later that evening, walking the surveyed lines with him alone as the last of the workers packed up for the day. Wanted the children to be able to see it, Nathan said. Not close enough to disturb it. Just close enough that if they ever asked why the school sat exactly here, somebody could tell them about a girl who loved stories more than almost anything else in the world. Abigail slipped her hand into his, saying nothing for a long moment, simply standing beside him at the edge of ground that had spent 21 years holding nothing but grief and would soon hold the sound of children's laughter instead. She'd have liked you, Nathan said quietly. Charlotte, I mean. She had a stubborn streak a mile wide, same as you. Never let anybody tell her what she couldn't do. I'd have liked her too, I think, Abigail said. Sounds like she raised a fairly decent brother, even if it took him 21 years and a burned barn wall to figure out how to ask for help. Nathan laughed, real and unguarded, the sound still unfamiliar enough to surprise him every time it happened. Don't forget the fist through the barn door. That was a fairly important part of the process, too. How could I forget? I believe that's the exact moment I first started to suspect you might be worth the trouble. Abigail squeezed his hand, looking out over the staked ground, the cabin standing quiet witness beside it. Your father built that cabin out of hope, Nathan. Seems fitting his grandchildren or somebody's grandchildren will learn their letters close enough to touch the same ground. Nathan didn't answer that directly, but something in his expression shifted, some quiet decision settling into place behind his eyes that he wasn't quite ready to say out loud. Yet not tonight. Though Abigail caught the look and filed it away all the same, patient as she'd always been willing to wait for him to find the words in his own time. They walked the surveyed lines together until the last of the evening light gave out 2 people who'd built something neither of them had expected to find on a ranch that 3 months earlier had been falling apart in a desperate man's bleeding hands. And somewhere in his coat pocket, close against his chest, a small box waited for the right moment to be opened. The proposal came 3 days later, though not in any way Nathan had planned it. He'd imagined the ridge maybe, or the cabin itself, somewhere fitting and quiet, where he could say everything he'd rehearsed a dozen times in his head. Instead, it happened in the kitchen past midnight, both of them still awake, going over the following week's accounts, because a late storm had knocked out 2 miles of fence, and the repair costs needed sorting before morning. Abigail set down her pencil, rubbing at tired eyes, and looked up to find Nathan watching her instead of the ledger in front of him. "What is it?" she asked. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you get right before you say something you've been building up the courage to say." She folded her hands, patient as ever, waiting him out the way she'd waited him out a dozen times before, over Charlotte, over the ranch, over every hard thing he'd ever needed time to reach. Nathan reached into his coat pocket, the small box having sat there 3 days now, waiting for a moment that refused to arrange itself into anything grand or perfect. He set it on the table between the scattered receipts and the half-finished ledger, plain as anything, exactly the way Hollis had told him to do it. "I bought this in Cheyenne," he said. "Been carrying it around since, waiting for the right moment. Turns out there isn't one. Turns out every moment with you feels like the right one. So I figured I'd stop waiting for a better one to show up." Abigail stared at the box, then at him. Something caught between disbelief and hope flickering across her face. "Nathan, let me say this plain, the way you taught me to say everything else worth saying." He reached across the table and took her hand steady, despite the pounding in his chest. "You walked off that stagecoach into a town that had already decided what you were worth before you said a word. You've spent your whole life proving people wrong, earning what should have been given to you freely from the start. I don't want to be one more person you have to prove yourself to. I know exactly what you're worth, Abigail Harper. I've known it since the day you told me my ranch was bleeding money, and I was too proud to see it." Her eyes were bright now, tears standing unshed, her hand trembling slightly in his. "I love you." Nathan said the words coming easier than he'd expected, easier than anything he'd said in 21 years. "Not because you saved this ranch, though God knows you did. Not because you're smarter than every man I've ever hired, though you are that too. I love you because you looked at every broken piece of me, the pride, the grief, the fists through barn doors, and you didn't flinch from a single bit of it. You stayed anyway. Marry me, Abigail. Stay for good this time. Not because a job needs doing, but because I can't imagine building whatever comes next without you standing beside me doing it." For a long moment, Abigail said nothing at all, and Nathan felt his heart drop straight through the floor, certain in that silence that he'd somehow gotten it all wrong. Then she was up out of her chair and around the table, pulling him to his feet and kissing him. Before he'd even fully registered, she'd moved fierce and certain and unguarded in a way that answered the question better than any word could have. "Yes," she said when she finally pulled back far enough to speak. "Yes, Nathan Calloway. 1,000 times yes." Nathan laughed, the sound rough with relief, and slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook only a little. It fit perfectly simple and solid, exactly as he'd asked for. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Sitting there watching you go quiet, I thought sure I'd misjudged the whole thing." "I was memorizing it," Abigail said, laughing through her own tears now. "Every word. I intend to remember exactly how you said all of that for the rest of my life, Nathan. A woman doesn't get proposed to like that twice in one lifetime, and I wasn't about to rush past it." They married 6 weeks later on a clear autumn morning with the whole territory in attendance. More people crowded into the yard than Nathan had ever seen gathered on his land at once. Mrs. Pruitt organized the flowers herself, insisting on it, and Silas Woodrow gave away the bride since Abigail had no family left of her own to stand up for her. "Proud to do it," Silas told her, offering his arm at the edge of the gathered crowd. "This whole territory owes you a debt we can't rightly repay, Miss Harper. Letting an old man walk you down an aisle is about the smallest thing I could offer in return." "It's not small to me," Abigail told him, and meant it. Hollis stood beside Nathan as his best man cane traded for the day, for a proper cane he'd carved himself over the preceding weeks, insisting a man ought to look sharp for an occasion this important. Jesse and Cooper stood further back among the hands, both grinning like fools, Jesse having won his bet about the timing after all, much to Cooper's good-natured disgust. When the preacher asked if anyone present had cause, why these two shouldn't be joined, the whole yard went quiet and still, and nobody said a single word. Not one voice raised an objection. Not from Bramwell, who hadn't dared show his face. Not from anyone at all in a territory that had spent months watching a woman prove her worth 100 times over. Nathan said his vows plain, the way he said everything that mattered. No flowery language, just simple truth, spoken straight from a heart that had finally learned how to open all the way. "I spent 36 years believing strength meant needing nobody," he said, voice carrying clear across the hushed yard. "You taught me different, Abigail. You taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is let somebody else see them broken and trust that they'll stay anyway. I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that trust was well placed." Abigail's own vows carried the same steady certainty she brought to everything, promising not perfection, but partnership, the kind built on honesty, on trust, earned rather than assumed on two people choosing each other again every single day, rather than resting on a single promise made once and never revisited. "I spent my whole life being told what I couldn't do, what I wasn't worth, simply by the way I looked standing in a doorway," she said, hazel eyes bright with unshed tears. "You looked at me the very first day and saw exactly what I could do instead. I promise to keep seeing you as clearly as you've always seen me. Nathan Calloway on the good days and the hard ones alike." When the preacher finally pronounced them married, the whole yard erupted into applause loud enough to send the horses in the corral stamping, and Cooper let out a whoop that carried clean across the whole ranch. And for the first time since Charlotte's death, the Calloway land rang out with nothing but pure, uncomplicated joy. "Now, 3 years passed the way years do on a working ranch, full and fast, marked more by seasons than by dates. The Walker schoolhouse they'd named it for. Charlotte. Her middle name given new life on a wooden sign above the door filled with children from 4 different ranching families within its first year. And by the 3rd year, Abigail herself had taken to teaching 2 mornings a week, finding in it a particular joy that surprised even her, watching children learn their letters on ground that had once held nothing but grief. The ranch itself had transformed in ways the whole territory still talked about. Fewer acres under grazing, but far higher profit from every one of them. Waste nearly disappeared entirely under systems Abigail had built and refined year after year. Workers stayed on longer than they ever had under Nathan's father, because for the first time in the ranch's history, loyalty ran in both directions instead of just one. Ranchers came from as far as Cheyenne to study how the Callaway operation ran so lean and so fair at once, and every single time without fail, Nathan corrected the same assumption. No, he'd say whenever visitors credited him with the transformation. I didn't do this. My wife reorganized this ranch from the ground up, and then she reorganized me right along with it. Abigail would laugh every time she heard him say it, though the pride in her eyes never dimmed no matter how many times the story got told. The second winter of their marriage tested them harder than any season before. It snow coming early, and hard drifts piling higher than any storm the territory had seen since the one that took Charlotte. And for 3 long days, the whole ranch sat snowed in, cut off from town, cut off from the doctor, with young Jesse's own wife, due to deliver their first child any day. Nathan felt the old fear rising in him the moment the first heavy snow started falling. Memory dragging him backward 23 years to another cabin, another winter, another life hanging in the balance, while the world outside turned white and impassable. I can't lose another person to a storm like this, he told Abigail that first night, voice tight with a dread he hadn't felt in years. I can't stand at another door watching snow pile up while somebody I care about fights for their life inside. You won't have to, Abigail said, already pulling out every book and pamphlet on childbirth she'd gathered over the years from traveling doctors and midwives passing through Larkspur, the same careful preparation she brought to every problem the ranch had ever handed her. I've helped birth calves more times than I can count, Nathan, and I've assisted 2 human births alongside a midwife back home before we lost our own land. I'm not a doctor, but I'm not helpless either, and neither are you. We're not standing at a door this time waiting for someone else to save the day. We're going in. They spent the worst of the storm in the small cabin Jesse shared with his young wife Abigail, directing with the same calm authority she'd shown during the fire years before Nathan, hauling water and keeping the stove fed and doing whatever else her steady instructions required of him, useful in a way he'd never once felt useful during Charlotte's final days. The baby came just past midnight on the storm's second night, healthy and loud and furious at the cold, and Jesse wept openly, holding his daughter for the first time, while his wife, exhausted, but smiling, thanked Abigail with a gratitude too large for words to hold. Nathan stepped outside afterward, needing air, needing a moment alone with everything the night had stirred loose in him, and found Abigail following a few minutes later, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the cold. We did it, she said softly. Nobody died in this storm, Nathan. Not tonight. I know. His voice was rough, thick with tears he didn't bother hiding anymore, not from her, not ever. 23 years I've dreaded storms like this one. Tonight I finally understood the difference. Last time we were 4 people alone in a cabin with no one coming. Tonight we had each other, and we weren't waiting on anyone else to save us. Abigail leaned into him, and they stood together in the falling snow a long moment. The storm around them, no longer something to fear, but simply weather, simply life continuing on the way it always did, indifferent and constant, met now by 2 people strong enough together to meet it without flinching. Charlotte would be glad, Abigail said quietly, knowing a storm like this one finally brought new life into this family instead of taking it away. Nathan pulled her closer, unable to speak, past the fullness in his throat, and simply nodded, letting the falling snow settle soft and quiet around them both. No longer a thing to be feared, but a thing at long last to be survived together. On a warm evening the following autumn, Nathan found her sitting on the porch steps exactly where he'd found her that very first difficult week, watching the sun drop low over land that no longer needed saving, only tending. "You're thinking about something," he said, settling beside her, the way he always did now, easy and certain, no hesitation left between them at all. "I'm thinking about that stagecoach," Abigail admitted. "The day I stepped off it into a town that had already decided what I was worth. I remember standing there thinking I had 1 week to prove myself before I'd be sent right back where I came from. And now I own half of this ranch, outright teach children their letters 2 mornings a week, and I'm married to a man who once put his fist through a barn door rather than admit he needed help." She smiled warm and unguarded, the smile of a woman who'd finally stopped waiting for the world to prove her wrong. "I'd say that week worked out better than I had any right to expect." Nathan took her hand, the same steady grip he'd offered her in the ravine on the ridge at the altar every single time she'd needed something solid to hold on to. "You didn't get lucky, Abigail. You earned every single piece of this. I just had the good sense to finally get out of your way and let you." "We've talked about a child of our own," Abigail said after a moment, quieter now. Something hopeful and uncertain in her voice that she rarely let show. "I know we've said we're in no hurry. But watching Jesse's daughter grow this past year, watching her run across that schoolyard just yesterday, laughing fit to burst, I find myself wanting that, Nathan, wanting it more than I expected to." "Then we'll have it," Nathan said simply. No hesitation at all. "Whenever it comes, however it comes. I've learned better than to plan every single thing down to the hour, Abigail. Some of the best things that ever happened to me arrived exactly when I least expected them to. Wearing a traveling case and a newspaper advertisement telling me plain to my face that I was wrong about everything I thought I knew." Abigail laughed bright and easy, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded fully from the sky. They sat together as the light faded fully. The schoolhouse visible in the distance where a lantern still burned in one window. Some child's mother finishing an evening lesson. The cabin beside it standing quiet and honored rather than avoided, holding grief transformed at last into something that helped the living instead of haunting them. Hollis found them there a while later, older, now slower, but still walking the ranch each evening out of pure habit and love for the place he'd given his whole working life to. He lowered himself into the third chair without needing an invitation the way he always had. "Whole territory still talks about it, you know," he said, nodding toward the ring on Abigail's hand, catching the last of the light. "How a woman half this county laughed at built herself a life nobody could argue with. My granddaughter asked me just last week if the stories about the Callaway Ranch were true. Told her every last word of it start to finish." "What did she say?" Abigail asked. "Said she wanted to grow up and be just as stubborn as you." Hollis chuckled low and warm. "Told her stubborn wasn't quite the right word for it. Told her the right word was strong, and there's a difference between the two, even if folks confuse them more often than they ought to." Local ranchers would say for years afterward that the story of the Callaway Ranch proved one simple truth, repeated in barns and kitchens and church pews across 4 counties, until it became something close to territorial legend, that a ranch is never saved by pride, and it is never saved by one man's strength alone. It is saved by people willing to look honestly at their own failures, by communities willing to admit when they've judged a person wrongly, and by the particular unglamorous courage it takes to ask for help before pride turns a fixable problem into an unfixable one. And more than that, they'd say watching Nathan and Abigail Callaway ride out together each morning to check on land that had once nearly broken them both. The strongest person in any room is very often the one everyone underestimated first, and the truest kind of love isn't the kind that rescues a person from who they are, but the kind that simply refuses to look away from the truth of them long enough for that truth to finally be seen valued and never doubted again. Nathan Callaway had run 4,000 acres for 15 years, believing strength meant needing no one. It took 1 week, 1 woman, and the whole rest of his life to learn he'd been wrong, and he never once regretted the lesson, not for a single day that followed. Not for as long as he lived, because the truest strength he ever found wasn't the kind that stood alone. It was the kind that finally fully learned how to stand beside somebody else instead.